Parents forged my name for a loan, so I let them steal my multi-million debt bomb. At least, that is what I would eventually allow to happen. But at this exact moment, I was simply sitting in the corner booth of a dimly lit, Michelin-starred restaurant, watching my mother slide a sleek, black leather presentation folder across the pristine white tablecloth toward me. "It is just a standard transfer of deed, Rebecca," my mother Patricia said, her voice dripping with that meticulously manufactured, honey-coated sweetness she reserved entirely for moments when she needed to extract something of immense value from me. My father, Richard, sat rigidly next to her, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, deliberately refusing to make eye contact with me as he swirled his expensive Bordeaux, projecting an aura of impatience, as if my mere presence was delaying his otherwise important evening. Across the table sat my younger brother, Preston, the undisputed golden child of the Caldwell family, 31 years old and currently vibrating with a toxic, restless energy, a mixture of unearned arrogance and the quiet, desperate panic of a man drowning in his own fabricated reality. He was the sole reason we were gathered here tonight, ostensibly celebrating the launch of his new revolutionary tech startup, a vague, jargon-filled venture that existed nowhere except in his grandiose delusions and the enabling, endlessly forgiving minds of our parents. Preston desperately needs an official headquarters for his upcoming investor meetings, my mother continued, her tone dropping into a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, hyper-aware of the wealthy patrons dining around us, ensuring our family's pristine public image remained untarnished. "Your little house in the suburbs is perfectly situated, and since you barely use the space for anything other than sleeping and doing your quiet little accounting job, it only makes sense for you to sign it over to him so he can leverage the equity to secure his seed funding." The sheer audacity of the request did not immediately register as shock. Instead, it settled deep in my chest as a cold, heavy, and painfully familiar weight. The exact sensation of being perceived not as a daughter, but as a conveniently placed stepping stone. I looked down at the dark leather folder, then shifted my gaze to Preston, who was busy taking a large sip of his whiskey, looking back at me with an entitled, arrogant smirk that clearly indicated he already considered my home to be his rightful property. Before I continue to tell you exactly how I responded to this breathtaking display of entitlement, please let me know down in the comments where you are watching from today, as it always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many women around the world connect with the exhausting reality of being the invisible workhorse of their family. The crystal chandelier above us cast a glaring, fractured light on the heavy silver Mont Blanc pen my father now placed deliberately on top of the leather folder, the metallic clink sounding like a gavel dropping in a courtroom. "We are not asking for a favor, Rebecca," Richard finally spoke, his voice carrying the low, authoritative timbre he used for decades to command corporate boardrooms, a carefully calibrated tone meant to make me feel small, compliant, and overwhelmingly obligated. "We are asking you to be a team player for once in your miserable life, because your brother is on the verge of a $50 million technological breakthrough, and you are selfishly sitting on a dormant asset that could guarantee his future." I did not raise my voice. I did not sigh, and I certainly did not reach for the silver pen. Instead, I carefully folded my linen napkin with deliberate precision and placed it softly beside my untouched plate of Chilean sea bass. "You want me to voluntarily sign over the deed to the home I purchased with my own money? The home I pay the mortgage on, so Preston can use it as collateral for a phantom company that does not have a single working prototype, a business plan, or a shred of actual revenue?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, channeling the absolute terrifying stillness that made me so exceptionally lethal in my actual heavily guarded profession. My mother scoffed, a sharp, ugly, dismissive sound that cut harshly through the soft jazz playing in the background of the restaurant. "Oh, please, Rebecca. Do not sit there and act like you understand high-level tech valuations or venture capital just because you sit in a cubicle and balance spreadsheets for a living, she sneered, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the mahogany table, her eyes narrowing with contempt. Your brother has vision. He has charisma, something you have never possessed a single day in your life, and as a family, we support each other's dreams. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive, heavy floral perfume suddenly becoming suffocating in the small space between us. Besides, you owe us for all the years we supported your tedious, uninspired little life, providing you with a roof over your head and a name that actually means something in this city. I stared into her eyes, quietly absorbing the absolute staggering detachment from reality it took for her to utter those words, considering the undeniable fact that I had paid my own way through university with academic scholarships, bought my own home with my own savings, and built my entire life in the shadows, while they willingly poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Preston's endless string of failed business ventures, his hidden gambling debts, and his luxury car leases. I will not be signing my house over to Preston, tonight or ever, I said quietly, holding her furious gaze until she was the one who blinked and looked away. The silence that instantly descended upon our table was heavy, toxic, and absolute, a sudden vacuum of air that signaled the death of their carefully constructed manipulation. Preston slammed his heavy whiskey glass down on the table, the amber liquid splashing violently onto the pristine white tablecloth, staining the fabric. "You are such a selfish, bitter, miserable woman, you know that," he hissed, his face flushing a deep mottled red with the petulant, uncontrollable rage of a spoiled man-child who had just been denied a toy he believed was his birthright. "I am trying to build an empire. I'm trying to elevate the Caldwell name to the next level. And you are sitting here hoarding a pathetic 3-bedroom house just out of spite because you are jealous of my potential." My father sighed loudly, shaking his head with a look of profound, theatrical disappointment, a specific look that would have absolutely crushed my spirit a decade ago, but now meant absolutely nothing to me. "We tried to do this the nice way, Rebecca. We tried to include you in the family's success," he said softly, snapping his fingers to signal the waiter for the check. "We will just have to find another way to secure Preston's future. No thanks to your complete lack of loyalty." They stood up in unison, a synchronized movement of rejection, leaving me sitting alone at the table to cover my own portion of the exorbitant bill, a final petty gesture designed to remind me of my lowly place in their hierarchy. I sat in silence and watched them walk out of the restaurant, a united front of delusions, arrogance, and entitlement, leaving me in the quiet aftermath of their ambush. I did not cry. I did not feel the sudden, desperate urge to chase after them into the parking lot, and I did not feel a shred of guilt for protecting my own sanctuary. Instead, a very specific, icy intuition settled deep into my bones. A professional instinct honed over years of dealing with corporate fraudsters, desperate debtors, and pathological liars. My father's parting words echoed relentlessly in my mind. "We will just have to find another way." They were entirely too calm, too coordinated, and far too willing to walk away from the table without staging a larger, more dramatic fight. When I finally arrived back at my quiet, secure suburban home an hour later, I did not turn on the hallway lights, nor did I take off my coat. I walked straight down the hall to my locked home office, booted up my heavily encrypted, multi-monitor workstation, and completely bypassed the standard consumer credit portals, logging directly into the advanced, highly classified federal clearinghouse systems I utilized every single day for my actual job as the founder and CEO of Apex Resolution Partners. They truly believed I was a low-level, struggling accountant. They had absolutely no idea I was a premier corporate debt restructuring expert, a specialized financial assassin who routinely liquidated multi-million-dollar toxic assets and dismantled fraudulent corporations before breakfast. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, executing a deep-level, comprehensive sweep of my own Social Security number, my property deeds, and my entire financial history. The system hummed quietly in the dark room, rapidly searching through municipal public records, obscure bank filings, and hidden federal liens. And then, the screen populated with a red flag. A sudden, paralyzing chill washed over my entire body, not from fear, but from the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the digital document staring back at me. There, legally attached to the deed of my fully paid-off home, was a freshly approved, high-risk commercial loan for exactly $300,000, finalized just 48 hours prior to our dinner. The lender was a notorious predatory private equity firm operating out of Nevada, known within my industry for charging exorbitant, borderline illegal interest rates and executing ruthless, immediate foreclosure tactics the moment a payment was missed. I clicked further into the file, my heart beating in a slow, measured rhythm, and saw that the entire $300,000 had already been dispersed into a newly formed corporate account registered exclusively to Preston Caldwell. I pulled up the digitized signature card for the loan documents, magnifying the image on my secondary monitor. Staring back at me, executed in my mother's unmistakable, looping, arrogant handwriting, was a flawless forgery of my signature. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They hadn't invited me to an expensive dinner to politely ask for my house. They had invited me to dinner to bully me into signing a transfer of deed that would retroactively cover up the fact that they had already stolen my equity, using the new deed to wash the fraudulent loan clean and protect themselves from federal forgery charges. They had maliciously weaponized my identity, stolen the sanctuary I built with my own hands, and handed the cash to a gambling addict who would undoubtedly burn through the entire sum in a matter of weeks, leaving me to face a devastating foreclosure and financial ruin. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally perfect in its cruelty, and so deeply unforgivable that it completely bypassed my heart and settled directly into the cold, analytical, ruthless sector of my brain. I did not pick up my phone to call the police, and I did not call my parents to scream, cry, or demand an explanation, because screaming would only give them the opportunity to gaslight me, to beg for unearned forgiveness, or to manipulate the situation into a family emergency that they would insist I was legally obligated to fix. Instead, I sat in the blue glow of my monitors, leaned back in my leather chair, and smiled a slow, terrifyingly calm smile in the empty room. If they wanted my financial profile so desperately, if they truly believed they were smart enough to play high-stakes financial games with my life and steal from a woman who literally dismantled fraudulent empires for a living, then I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, wrapped in a bow. I opened a new, highly secure file on my private server and began to draft the intricate legal blueprints for a financial trap so complex, so legally binding, and so utterly destructive that by the time they realized they had swallowed poison, there would be no house, no tech empire, and no family wealth left to save them. I accessed the dark portfolio of Apex Resolution Partners and carefully selected the files of 3 massive, hopelessly bankrupt commercial trucking companies I had recently acquired for pennies on the dollar, companies drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, pending IRS tax liens, and severe OSHA penalties. With a few keystrokes, I initiated the legal paperwork to merge all of this catastrophic, life-ruining liability into a single brand-new Delaware shell company, a corporate entity I named Apex Green Solutions, LLC, outfitting it with a flawless, impenetrable liability clause that stated whoever signed on as the sole owner and CEO would instantly, personally, and irrevocably inherit every single cent of the accumulated debt. The blue light of my multiple monitors cast long, sharp shadows across the mahogany surface of my desk as I sat perfectly still, absorbing the digital reality of the $300,000 chain my family had just wrapped around my neck. I did not cry, nor did I reach for my phone to demand an explanation, because tears and outrage were currencies my parents had learned to devalue decades ago, viewing any display of my pain as a mere inconvenience to their ambitions rather than a boundary they had crossed. Instead, I leaned closer to the high-resolution screen, my eyes tracing the digitized curves and loops of my forged signature on the commercial loan agreement, marveling at the sheer, terrifying audacity of my mother's steady hand. It was a flawless replication, a testament to how closely Patricia Caldwell had studied me over the years, not out of maternal affection, but out of a predatory need to know exactly how to mimic my movements when it inevitably served her or my brother. The lender, a notoriously aggressive private equity firm based in Nevada known as Vanguard Capital Partners, was not an institution that dealt in leniency, grace periods, or polite reminder letters. They were financial scavengers, the kind of corporate vultures I routinely annihilated in my day-to-day operations at Apex Resolution Partners, specializing in high-interest predatory loans that were specifically designed to force borrowers into default so they could seize the underlying collateral. They had bypassed the standard residential mortgage protocols entirely, framing the transaction as a high-risk commercial equity extraction, which meant the consumer protections I might have relied upon in a traditional bank setting were completely non-existent. But what truly fascinated me in the quiet, suffocating stillness of my home office was not the loan itself, but the meticulous, calculated logistics of the fraud, because securing a loan of this magnitude required a notary public, an authorized, state-sanctioned witness who had legally sworn they had seen me sign these documents in person. I opened a secondary terminal on my workstation, bypassing standard encryption protocols with the elite access credentials I maintained as a premier corporate liquidator, and pulled the digitized notary stamp attached to the final page of the loan docket. The name staring back at me was Sterling Vance, a senior partner at a mid-sized accounting firm in the city, but more importantly, a man who had played golf with my father every Sunday at the Oak Ridge Country Club for the better part of 2 decades. The betrayal was not a crime of opportunity committed in a moment of desperate panic. It was a carefully orchestrated, premeditated conspiracy involving my father leveraging his country club connections to bypass federal identification laws, my mother practicing my signature until it flowed like her own, and my brother eagerly holding the bag to catch the stolen cash. I tapped a few keys, accessing the bank's internal closing metadata, and discovered that the documents had been executed in a private conference room at Sterling's downtown office 3 days ago, right around the time my mother had called me to casually ask if I was still going to be out of town for a corporate restructuring conference. They had timed the theft perfectly, ensuring I was 3 states away while they sat in a leather-bound boardroom, laughing over scotch, casually signing away the sanctuary I had spent the last 8 years building with my own blood, sweat, and relentless overtime. A deep, profound silence settled over my house, the kind of silence that follows the death of something fundamental, and in that exact moment, sitting in the cold glow of my monitors, the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty quietly snapped. For 33 years, I had been the invisible foundation of the Caldwell family, the quiet, responsible daughter who fixed the broken things, paid the forgotten bills, and smiled politely through the holidays, while Preston was paraded around as the visionary genius who just needed one more loan or one more chance to change the world. I had allowed them to believe I was a mid-level, struggling accountant because the truth of my wealth and power would have only made me a larger target for their parasitic demands. But in my silence, they had mistaken my grace for weakness, my humility for stupidity, and my boundaries for suggestions. I reached out and picked up my heavy, silver monogrammed pen, turning it slowly in my fingers, feeling the cool metal against my skin as the grief evaporated. instantly replaced by the terrifying diamond-hard clarity of an apex predator who had just been invited to a hunt. If my family wanted to play in the deep, dangerous waters of high-stakes corporate finance, if they truly believed they could weaponize my identity and steal my home to fund a gambling addict's delusions, then I was not going to stop them. I was going to help them build their empire, and I was going to make sure the foundation was poured entirely with federal explosives. I minimized the fraudulent loan documents and opened the highly classified, encrypted servers of Apex Resolution Partners, navigating to a restricted subfolder labeled Toxic Assets. As a corporate debt restructuring specialist, my firm routinely purchased dying, hopelessly indebted companies for pennies on the dollar, either to liquidate their remaining physical assets or to meticulously dismantle them to offset tax liabilities for massive conglomerates. 3 weeks prior, I had quietly acquired a cluster of 3 failing commercial trucking logistics companies: Horizon Transit, Ironclad Freight, and Apex Hauling, which were currently bleeding out under the crushing weight of $42 million in defaulted bank loans, severe federal EPA fines for illegal dumping, and a massive, inescapable IRS tax lien for years of unpaid payroll taxes. These companies were not just bankrupt, they were financial black holes, radioactive entities carrying what the industry called joint and several absolute liability, meaning whoever held the executive titles and ownership of these companies would be instantly, personally, and relentlessly pursued by the federal government and private creditors for every single cent, bypassing any standard corporate veil protections. Working in the absolute silence of my home, with the moon casting long white rectangles across my hardwood floors, I began the meticulous legal process of merging these 3 toxic, debt-ridden nightmares into a single, brand-new Delaware-registered shell company. Delaware is famously opaque, a corporate haven where ownership can be hidden behind layers of registered agents, making it the perfect incubator for the financial trap I was currently building. I named the new entity Apex Green Solutions, LLC. A title designed specifically to sound like the kind of trendy, environmentally conscious tech startup that would make my brother foam at the mouth with unearned ambition. Into this pristine, newly minted LLC, I quietly folded all $42 million of the toxic trucking debt, burying the catastrophic liabilities deep within the operating agreement's subclauses, camouflaging the federal liens and defaulted loans beneath layers of complex, impenetrable legal jargon that would look like standard indemnification clauses to an arrogant amateur. I structured the bylaws of Apex Green Solutions, LLC, with a very specific lethal trigger mechanism. The moment a new chief executive officer signed the operating agreement and accepted 100% of the membership shares, they would legally and irrevocably assume personal, unconditional responsibility for all legacy debts, liens, and federal tax obligations held by the company, as is, and effective immediately. I spent the next 4 hours drafting the bait, utilizing my extensive knowledge of venture capital language to create a stunning 50-page confidential investment prospectus for Apex Green Solutions, LLC, detailing a completely fabricated, highly sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithm supposedly designed to revolutionize green energy grids. I fabricated financial projections showing a guaranteed 40% year-over-year return. I mocked up letters of intent from fake international investors, and I explicitly placed a preliminary valuation of $50 million on the company, ensuring the number was stamped in bold red ink across the executive summary. This was not just a document, it was a psychological weapon, meticulously engineered to exploit my brother's crippling narcissism, his desperate need for overnight wealth, and his deep-seated belief that he was destined to be a tech billionaire without ever actually doing the work. I knew Preston was currently drowning in secret gambling debts, desperate for a lifeline, And I knew my parents were equally desperate to maintain the illusion of their son's success at their precious country club. If they saw a $50 million opportunity sitting unguarded, they would not just try to take it, they would justify stealing it, convincing themselves that I was too small-minded to handle such an empire. At exactly 4 a.m, the heavy silence of the house was broken by the rhythmic mechanical hum of my high-end laser printer springing to life, spitting out the thick, glossy pages of the prospectus. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, binding them neatly into a dark leather folder that looked almost identical to the one my mother had slid across the table at the Michelin-starred restaurant just hours prior. I ran my fingers over the embossed cover, feeling no guilt, no hesitation, and absolutely no pity for the people whose blood shared my veins, because they had made their choice when they forged my name and sold my sanctuary to the highest bidder. They wanted to steal my life, but they had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting in the quiet suburbs was the architect of corporate graveyards, and I was about to let them legally, proudly, and arrogantly sign their own financial death warrants. The heavy leather binder resting on my mahogany desk felt less like a collection of printed paper and more like a loaded weapon, its sleek black cover concealing the financial equivalent of a nuclear warhead that I had just spent the entire night meticulously constructing in the absolute silence of my home. As the morning sun finally began to bleed through the wooden blinds of my home office, casting a pale, unforgiving light across the multiple glowing monitors that still displayed the devastating reality of my forged signature on that $300,000 commercial loan, I ran my fingertips over the embossed title of the prospectus, Apex Green Solutions, LLC. Confidential Investment Summary. Pre-valuation, $50 million. It was a masterpiece of corporate camouflage, a beautifully formatted, data-heavy illusion designed to perfectly mirror the arrogant, buzzword-laden tech startups my brother Preston constantly idolized but possessed absolutely none of the discipline to actually build. Inside this binder, buried beneath 50 pages of fabricated artificial intelligence algorithms, mock environmental impact studies, and falsified letters of intent from phantom European venture capitalists, lay the agonizing, inescapable truth of the 3 bankrupt logistics companies I had quietly folded into this new Delaware entity. Horizon Transit, Ironclad Freight, and Apex Hauling were not just failing businesses. They were catastrophic financial black holes carrying $42 million in defaulted loans, crippling federal EPA penalties for illegal chemical dumping, and a massive, unyielding IRS lien for half a decade of unpaid payroll taxes. By legally merging these radioactive assets into Apex Green Solutions, LLC, I had created what my industry referred to as a liability vacuum, a corporate structure where the toxic debt was not dissolved, but rather concentrated and weaponized, waiting patiently for a designated fall guy. The bylaws I had drafted and slipped into the very back of the binder, intentionally printed in dense, 8-point font beneath a boring, standard-looking indemnification header, contained the lethal trigger, a clause stating that whoever signed on as the sole executive officer and accepted 100% of the membership shares would legally, immediately, and unconditionally waive all corporate veil protections, assuming personal, joint, and several liability for every single cent of the legacy debt, effectively signing away their financial future, their credit, and their freedom to the federal government. I knew with absolute chilling certainty that my family would never read the fine print, because reading required diligence, patience, and a fundamental respect for the details, traits my parents had systematically completely bypassed in their endless quest to hand Preston the world on a silver platter. They operated on the arrogant assumption that because I was merely a quiet, uninspiring accountant in their eyes, I was inherently incapable of producing anything complex enough to threaten them. And that condescension was exactly what I was counting on as I prepared to walk directly into the lion's den. Sunday dinner at my parents' sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate in the historic, affluent suburbs was a mandatory, weekly theatrical production, a meticulously staged event where my mother played the role of the gracious, wealthy matriarch. My father held court as the wise patriarch, and Preston soaked up their endless adoration while I was expected to sit quietly in the corner, serving as the invisible audience to their fabricated perfection. I spent an hour carefully selecting my armor for the afternoon, deliberately choosing a beige, slightly wrinkled linen blouse and sensible scuffed loafers, tying my hair back into a severe unstyled bun, intentionally stripping away any hint of the sharp, powerful CEO I actually was, and wrapping myself in the exhaustion and defeat they expected to see from a woman who had just been bullied at a Michelin-starred restaurant 2 nights prior. I packed the heavy leather binder and my encrypted work laptop into a faded canvas tote bag, ensuring the corner of the prospectus was just visible enough to catch a wandering eye, and drove the 45 minutes to their neighborhood, navigating the winding oak-lined streets until I pulled into the massive circular driveway of their colonial-style home. The moment I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door, the overwhelming nostalgic scent of slow-roasted lamb, garlic, and heavily buttered yeast rolls hit me, a sensory illusion of warmth and maternal care that aggressively masked the toxic, transactional reality of this family. "Oh, you actually decided to show up," my mother Patricia called out from the massive Marble Island kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine Williams-Sonoma apron, her tone dripping with that specific brand of passive-aggressive surprise designed to immediately put me on the defensive. She did not ask how I was, she did not apologize for the dinner 3 nights ago, and she certainly did not mention the $300,000 she had illegally extracted from the equity of my home using my stolen identity. Instead, she looked me up and down with a tight, disappointed smile, her eyes lingering critically on my wrinkled blouse. "I honestly assumed you were going to sit in your little house all day and pout about the deed transfer, but I am glad you decided to be an adult and join the family, even if you look like you just rolled out of bed." I did not flinch. I did not defend my wardrobe, and I did not let a single ounce of the simmering, icy rage beneath my skin show on my face. I simply offered a tired, subservient nod, leaning heavily against the doorframe to project an aura of complete, overwhelming exhaustion. "I've just been swamped with work, Mom," I said quietly, my voice soft and deliberately devoid of any combative energy, perfectly mirroring the broken, compliant daughter she believed she had successfully beaten into submission. "I brought some files to finish up before Monday." My father, Richard, emerged from his dark-paneled study, a crystal tumbler of expensive bourbon already resting comfortably in his hand, his eyes scanning me with the same cold, calculating indifference he reserved for underperforming employees. "Well, do not let your paperwork ruin the mood, Rebecca," he boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he casually adjusted his gold Rolex. "Preston is having a very important week. He's finalizing some massive investor meetings for his tech launch, and we are here to celebrate his momentum, so I suggest you leave whatever petty grievances you are harboring at the door." Right on cue, Preston strolled down the grand, sweeping staircase, dressed in a designer silk shirt he absolutely could not afford, but beneath his arrogant swagger, my trained eyes immediately detected the subtle, frantic physical markers of a man drowning in extreme, immediate panic. There was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned chill of the house. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear, and his right hand constantly, obsessively drifted to the pocket of his slacks where his phone was undoubtedly vibrating, with threatening messages from the loan sharks he owed. He had $300,000 of my stolen money sitting in his fraudulent corporate account, but I knew the street debts of a severe gambling addict were always astronomically higher than what they admitted, and Preston was clearly entirely out of time, desperately searching for a miracle to save his kneecaps. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence," Preston sneered, stopping at the bottom of the stairs to flash me a condescending, entirely hollow smile. his eyes darting nervously toward my canvas bag before locking onto my face. "Come to finally sign the house over, sis. Or are you still pretending that your little accounting job is more important than the family legacy?" I swallowed the immediate instinctual urge to dismantle his entire existence right then and there, remembering the golden rule of the long con. You never interrupt an enemy when they are in the process of destroying themselves. "I am just here for dinner, Preston," I replied softly, clutching the canvas bag a little tighter to my chest, a deliberate gesture of defensiveness designed to make the bag appear incredibly valuable. I walked past them, moving into the expansive, sunlit living room, and carefully set my bag down on the heavy glass coffee table, making a show of letting out a long, ragged sigh as I pulled out my laptop and the leather binder. I opened the laptop, typing in a dummy password to unlock a specifically curated, unencrypted desktop, and brought up the digital version of the Apex Green Solutions prospectus, ensuring the massive, bold red letters declaring the $50 million valuation were glowing brightly on the screen. I placed the physical leather binder directly next to the keyboard, intentionally leaving it slightly open so the mock-up of the AI grid and the fabricated venture capital letters were entirely visible to anyone who walked past. "Rebecca, get in here and help me slice the lamb. You know your father hates waiting," my mother snapped from the kitchen, her voice echoing with the harsh, entitled demand of a woman who viewed her daughter purely as domestic labor. It was the perfect, entirely natural excuse to leave the trap completely unguarded. "Coming, Mom," I called back, my voice meek and obedient. I stood up, deliberately leaving the laptop screen glowing and the binder exposed, and walked slowly toward the kitchen. But I did not go all the way in. Instead, I stopped just out of sight in the long, shadowed hallway, perfectly positioned behind a large, decorative indoor palm tree, where I had a clear, unobstructed reflection of the living room through the massive antique mirror hanging on the wall. I held my breath, the silence in the hallway heavy and vibrating with anticipation as I watched Preston's reflection pace nervously near the staircase. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his face pale as he read a message, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat, before he shoved the phone away and walked into the living room, heading toward the liquor cabinet. But as he passed the glass coffee table, the bright glow of my laptop screen caught his eye, and he stopped dead in his tracks. Through the mirror, I watched the exact moment my brother's desperate, arrogant mind registered the bold red numbers on the screen, his eyes widening in a mixture of disbelief and ravenous, unchecked greed. He glanced quickly toward the kitchen, listening to the sound of my mother complaining about the dullness of the carving knife, and my father pouring another drink, before he stepped closer to the table, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out and touched the leather binder. He flipped the cover open completely, his eyes scanning the first page of the executive summary, his lips moving silently as he read the fabricated words, "Exclusive intellectual property, AI green energy integration, guaranteed 40% yield, sole proprietorship transfer ready." It was the ultimate, irresistible bait for a man who desperately wanted to be a billionaire without doing a single day of actual work. A man who had been raised to believe that everything I possessed was rightfully his for the taking. He didn't see a massive $42 million federal liability trap. He saw a golden ticket, a secret multi-million-dollar project that his stupid, low-level accountant sister had somehow stumbled upon or quietly built in her spare time. And in his narcissistic, entitled brain, he instantly rationalized that he deserved it more than I did. I watched in cold, absolute silence as Preston quickly pulled a silver USB drive from his keychain, a drive he always carried to steal software and pitch decks from his wealthier friends, and jammed it into the side of my laptop, his fingers flying across the trackpad as he initiated a mass download of the entire Apex Green Solutions file directory. As the files transferred, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number, holding the device close to his mouth, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper that echoed perfectly down the quiet hallway and straight to my ears. "Yeah, it's me. Listen to me. I need you to call them off for just one more week, Preston hissed into the phone, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the progress bar on the screen inched closer to 100%. I know what I owe, but you have to trust me. I just found something massive. I'm talking a $50 million tech valuation that is completely undocumented, and I am going to have full ownership by the end of the month. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, his face twisting into a nasty, arrogant sneer that looked exactly like my father's, because it belongs to my sister, and she is a weak, pathetic pushover who will sign over the rights the second my parents and I put the pressure on her. So just give me a week and I will pay you back triple. I swear to God. The download complete chime pinged softly on the laptop, and Preston instantly yanked the USB drive out, shoving it deep into his pocket, completely unaware that the files he had just stolen contained embedded, heavily encrypted tracking metadata that would notify my private servers the absolute second he opened them on his own network, giving me a digital, irrefutable timestamp of his corporate espionage. He closed the binder, adjusted his expensive shirt, and strolled toward the kitchen, whistling a low, cheerful tune, the panic entirely erased from his face, replaced by the smug, triumphant glow of a predator who believed he had just effortlessly outsmarted his prey. I waited in the shadows of the hallway for 3 more seconds, letting the profound, deeply tragic reality of his betrayal wash over me, feeling the last remaining atoms of mercy I held for my family evaporate into the cold air. They were entirely, hopelessly irredeemable, bound together by a toxic, shared delusion of superiority that blinded them to the very real, very dangerous world operating just outside their country club bubble. I smoothed down my wrinkled linen blouse, adjusted my expression into a mask of mild, subservient exhaustion, and stepped out of the shadows, walking into the kitchen to help my mother slice the lamb, fully prepared to play the role of the tragic, helpless victim all the way to the courtroom, knowing that the countdown to their absolute financial annihilation had officially, irrevocably begun. The drive back to my sanctuary in the quiet suburbs that Sunday evening was accompanied by the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of my tires on the asphalt and the profound, heavy realization that I was officially navigating a point of no return with the people who shared my blood. I had spent the remainder of that suffocating dinner playing my assigned role to absolute perfection, slicing the roasted lamb, silently enduring my mother's thinly veiled critiques about my lackluster social life, and listening to my father pontificate about the aggressive nature of modern wealth accumulation, all while Preston sat across from me with the sickening, glowing complacency of a thief who believed he had just successfully robbed a blind woman. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the artificial warmth of their historic colonial home instantly evaporated from my skin, replaced by the sterile, hyper-focused adrenaline that fueled my actual career as a corporate liquidator. I did not bother turning on the main lights of my house. I walked straight down the hallway, the familiar click of my sensible loafers echoing against the hardwood, and unlocked the heavy, reinforced door to my home office. The multiple monitors of my workstation were already pulsing with a soft, urgent blue light, displaying a cascading series of automated alerts generated by the highly encrypted proprietary tracking software I had secretly embedded within the files of the Apex Green Solutions prospectus. I sank into my leather ergonomic chair, a cold, predatory smile slowly touching the corners of my mouth as I opened the server logs, watching the digital footprint of my brother's unchecked greed unfurl across the screen in real time. According to the IP address pinging my server, Preston had not even waited until he returned to his overpriced, parent-funded downtown loft. He had pulled his car into the parking lot of a high-end strip mall exactly 3 miles from my parents' house, plugged the stolen USB drive into his own laptop, and immediately opened the fabricated $50 million valuation summary. The metadata was breathtakingly revealing, tracking exactly how many seconds his cursor lingered on each page, providing me with a flawless psychological profile of his catastrophic arrogance. He spent exactly 4 minutes staring at the projected revenue graphs and the fake letters of intent from phantom European venture capitalists, completely intoxicated by the illusion of effortless astronomical wealth. But he spent less than 3 seconds scrolling past the dense, 8-point font of the corporate bylaws, entirely ignoring the meticulously crafted liability clauses that explicitly tied the owner of the LLC to $42 million of toxic, federally mandated debt. He did not care about the operational mechanics, the legal structure, or the foundational integrity of the company he believed he was stealing. He only cared about the prestige, the title, and the immediate cash extraction, a fatal flaw that my parents had spent his entire life carefully cultivating by shielding him from the consequences of his own incompetence. By midnight, the tracking software notified me that Preston had forwarded the stolen PDF to a highly unsecured third-party email address belonging to a man named Victor Vance, the notorious sharply dressed loan shark who operated under the guise of an independent wealth management consultant. The exact man I suspected held the markers for Preston's massive hidden gambling debts. My brother was actively weaponizing the fake empire I had built to buy himself more time on the streets, promising a violent predator a piece of a $50 million pie that was actually composed entirely of federal tax liens, bankrupt trucking logistics, and severe EPA violations. The trap was no longer just set. It had been swallowed whole. And now all I had to do was wait for the poison to begin shutting down their central nervous system. The agonizing wait did not last long, because the very next morning, as I sat in my actual sprawling corner office at Apex Resolution Partners, a fortress of glass and steel located on the 42nd floor of the city's most exclusive commercial high-rise, my private cell phone began to vibrate with a call from my mother. I paused my review of a massive corporate liquidation docket, took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee, and let the phone ring 4 times before answering, ensuring I sounded appropriately distracted and subservient. "Hello, Mom," I said softly, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline, feeling the absolute jarring contrast between the multi-million-dollar empire I commanded and the pathetic, helpless persona she believed I occupied. "Rebecca, darling," Patricia Caldwell cooed, her voice dripping with an unnatural, sugary warmth that instantly set every single professional alarm bell in my head ringing in unison. It was the exact, calculated tone she used when she was preparing to orchestrate a massive manipulation, a tone entirely devoid of the harsh, dismissive condescension she had weaponized just last night over the lamb roast. "Your father and I were talking this morning, and we just feel completely terrible about how things escalated at the restaurant last week, because you know we love you, and family should never fight over silly financial misunderstandings." I remained completely silent, utilizing the devastating power of a quiet pause, forcing her to fill the uncomfortable void with more of her manufactured narrative. "We want to make things right, sweetheart," she continued, her breathing slightly elevated with poorly concealed anxiety. "We know how much your little house means to you, and Preston has realized that he simply cannot ask you to sacrifice your home for his tech launch. So your father has decided to secure the funding for Preston another way." I kept my voice perfectly flat, meticulously controlling my breathing so she could not detect the cold amusement radiating through my veins. "That is good to hear, Mom. I appreciate that." She cleared her throat, the sweet facade cracking just a fraction of an inch to reveal the desperate, calculating machinery working beneath. "Yes. Well, we actually want to help you, Rebecca, because we know you have been dabbling in some little side projects, trying to build something for yourself. And Preston mentioned he saw some paperwork for a small LLC you registered called Apex Green Solutions. The sheer audacity of the pivot was almost beautiful in its sociopathic perfection. They were actually going to pretend that Preston had innocently stumbled upon my files. and they were going to frame their hostile takeover of my intellectual property as a benevolent act of parental charity. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied smoothly, infusing my voice with a slight manufactured tremor of panic, playing the role of the secretive, incompetent daughter who had just been caught hiding something valuable. "It is just a theoretical project. It doesn't mean anything." My mother laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound that echoed through the receiver. "Oh, do not be so modest, darling. Preston actually had his legal team look at the concept, and while it is incredibly raw and full of amateur mistakes, he thinks he might be able to salvage the core idea and integrate it into his own massive tech platform." She paused, delivering the killing blow with the practiced ease of an assassin. "Your father and I are willing to completely pay off that $300,000 commercial loan we acquired against your house, clearing your deed entirely, if you simply sign over the rights to this little Apex Green project to your brother." There it was, the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of their conspiracy, spoken aloud in a casual morning phone call as if they were discussing the weather rather than a devastating string of federal felonies. They were openly admitting to forging my signature on a $300,000 loan, holding the potential foreclosure of my sanctuary over my head as a weapon of extortion, demanding I hand over a $50 million asset in exchange for them fixing the very crisis they had illegally created. They believed they had brilliantly outmaneuvered me, cornering the weak, compliant matriarch into surrendering her hidden treasure, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that they were aggressively demanding the keys to a $42 million federal prison cell. I spent a lot of time on that project," I whispered into the phone, allowing my voice to break slightly, giving them the exact emotional resistance they needed to feel victorious. "It is my only chance to build something real." My mother's tone instantly hardened, the sugary warmth vanishing, replaced by the ruthless, domineering matriarch who refused to be denied. "Rebecca, do not be ridiculous and selfish. You do not have the capital, the connections, or the intellect to execute a corporate launch of this magnitude, and you will only embarrass yourself and the family name if you try." She let the threat hang in the air for a fraction of a second before lowering her voice into a cold, absolute command. "We are offering you a clean slate for your house, which you desperately need, so you will meet us at Sterling Vance's law office at 3 o'clock this afternoon to sign the transfer of ownership, or we will stop paying the monthly premiums on that commercial loan and let Vanguard Capital foreclose on your property by the end of the month." She ended the call without waiting for my response, the line clicking dead in my ear, leaving me standing in the silence of my massive executive office. I slowly lowered the phone, looking down at the bustling city streets 42 floors below, feeling a profound, chilling sense of peace wash over my entire body. They had just provided me with the ultimate, legally bulletproof alibi by actively extorting me to sign over the LLC under the threat of foreclosure, utilizing a corrupt notary like Sterling Vance to facilitate the transfer. They were inadvertently creating a massive paper trail that proved this was a hostile, coerced takeover. When the federal government eventually came looking for the $42 million in toxic debt, Preston and my parents would never be able to claim that I had maliciously tricked them into taking the company, because the documents would clearly show that they had ruthlessly forced me to surrender it. I spent the next 4 hours finalizing legitimate, multi-million-dollar restructuring deals for my actual clients, compartmentalizing the impending destruction of my family with the cold, ruthless efficiency that had made me a legend in the underground corporate financial sector. At 2:30, I left my fortress of glass and steel, once again stripping away my designer blazer and luxury watch, swapping them in my car for an oversized, slightly faded cardigan and the same scuffed, sensible loafers, perfectly reconstructing the armor of the defeated, exhausted daughter. When I arrived at the polished mahogany and brass lobby of Sterling Vance's downtown law firm, The receptionist immediately directed me to the primary corner conference room, her eyes holding a flicker of pity that told me she had likely already heard the Caldwell family loudly discussing my impending surrender. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping into a room that practically reeked of expensive cologne, old leather, and unchecked entitlement. My father sat at the head of the massive table, checking his emails on his phone with an air of complete boredom, while my mother sat next to him, sipping sparkling water, looking fiercely triumphant. Preston was practically vibrating out of his custom-tailored suit at the opposite end of the table, his eyes locked onto a thick stack of legal documents resting in front of an empty leather chair, his leg bouncing with the frantic, uncontrollable energy of a degenerate gambler who believed he was minutes away from hitting the ultimate jackpot. Sterling Vance, the corrupt country club golfing notary who had illegally authorized the forgery of my home loan, stood near the window, flashing me a condescending, overly sympathetic smile as I walked into the room. "Rebecca, thank you for being reasonable and joining us," Sterling said smoothly, gesturing toward the empty chair with a silver pen in his hand. "We have prepared a very straightforward transfer of sole proprietorship and membership interest, which will officially completely sever your ties to Apex Green Solutions LLC and designate Preston as the sole managing member and CEO." I did not look at Preston, and I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the thick stack of papers on the table, projecting an aura of complete broken submission as I slowly lowered myself into the chair. "And the loan on my house?" I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper, clutching the sleeves of my oversized cardigan. My father didn't even bother looking up from his phone. "Once the transfer is complete, I will wire the $300,000 to Vanguard Capital to clear the lien. Consider it a generous buyout for your amateur little project." I reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the documents closer to me, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text Sterling had prepared. It was a standard, aggressive corporate takeover contract, completely transferring all assets, intellectual property, and, most importantly, all existing liabilities, debts, and federal obligations of Apex Green Solutions, LLC directly onto Preston's shoulders. Sterling had used a boilerplate template, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was legally binding my brother to a $42 million radioactive bomb, because neither he nor my parents, nor Preston, had bothered to run a deep-level federal audit on the shell company, arrogantly assuming a company registered by a simple accountant couldn't possibly possess any real-world debt. "This document says Preston assumes all liabilities associated with the entity," I said quietly, dragging my finger across the specific clause, giving them one final, absolute chance to look closely at the trap they were sprinting into. Preston let out a loud, harsh bark of laughter, leaning across the table to snatch the silver pen from Sterling and aggressively shove it into my hand. "Just sign the damn paper, Rebecca. There are no liabilities because you haven't even done anything with the company yet. You just registered the name and made some pretty graphs," he sneered, his face twisting with cruel, impatient superiority. "I am taking all the risk here. I am the one who has to actually build the empire, so stop trying to play lawyer and just give me what is mine." I looked at his flushed, greedy face, then shifted my gaze to my mother, who was glaring at me with cold, uncompromising demands, and finally to my father, who sighed loudly, clearly annoyed that this hostile theft was taking more than 5 minutes of his precious time. They did not see a human being sitting across from them. They saw a resource to be mined, an obstacle to be crushed, and a convenient scapegoat for their own moral rot. And in that exact, crystal-clear moment, the final lingering shadow of my guilt vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but the terrifying grace of a matriarch who was finally putting the burden down. I tightened my grip on the heavy silver pen, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin, lowered my head to hide the absolute predatory calm in my eyes, and signed my name on the dotted line, legally, permanently, and irrevocably handing my brother the detonator to his own absolute destruction. The heavy glass doors of Sterling Vance's downtown law firm closed behind me with a soft, final click, sealing the suffocating smell of expensive leather, aged scotch, and unchecked arrogance inside the building, while the crisp late-afternoon city air hit my face, carrying with it the profound, intoxicating weightlessness of a woman who had just successfully handed her executioners their own meticulously crafted guillotine. I walked slowly toward my car, deliberately maintaining the slight slump in my shoulders and the slow, defeated cadence of my steps until I was safely enclosed within the tinted, soundproof sanctuary of my vehicle, where I finally allowed the mask of the broken, subservient daughter to slip away, replaced by the terrifying, diamond-hard clarity of an apex predator who had just locked the cage from the outside. By signing that boilerplate transfer of sole proprietorship, I had legally and irrevocably severed all of my ties to Apex Green Solutions, LLC, successfully transferring 100% of the membership shares, the fabricated intellectual property, and most crucially, the $42 million in toxic federal debt, severe EPA penalties, and defaulted corporate loans directly onto Preston's entirely oblivious shoulders. True to his word, within 24 hours of the ink drying on that fraudulent corporate takeover, my father proudly emailed me a confirmation receipt showing a wire transfer of $300,000 to Vanguard Capital Partners, fully satisfying the predatory commercial loan they had illegally taken out against my property, effectively handing me back the unencumbered deed to my sanctuary while simultaneously funding their own absolute destruction. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched in absolute morbid fascination from the quiet safety of my heavily encrypted home servers as my brother Preston rapidly accelerated his own demise. Completely intoxicated by the illusion of the empire he believed he had so brilliantly stolen from his weak, small-minded sister, he immediately updated his LinkedIn profile and all of his social media accounts, proudly listing himself as the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Apex Green Solutions, boldly displaying the fabricated $50 million valuation as if it were cold, hard cash sitting in a checking account. He used the newly acquired, officially notarized LLC documentation to immediately secure a massive, high-interest line of credit from a secondary tier of aggressive, predatory lenders, using the fabricated venture capital letters of intent as collateral. And within 3 days, he had purchased a brand-new, matte black Porsche 911, leased a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse office space in the financial district, and began throwing lavish, champagne-soaked launch parties for a company that literally only existed as a holding cell for federal tax liens. My parents, entirely blinded by their desperate need for country club validation and their unwavering belief in Preston's inherent superiority, eagerly fueled the charade, sending out embossed invitations to their wealthy friends for an exclusive dinner party at the Oak Ridge Country Club to officially celebrate Preston's monumental tech acquisition, intentionally inviting me with the explicit, cruel purpose of forcing me to sit in the corner and witness the ascension of the son they actually loved. But before that dinner could even take place, the meticulously designed mechanisms of my trap caught the attention of the exact federal entity I had been quietly waiting for, a development that arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in the form of a tall, impeccably dressed man who bypassed my receptionist at Apex Resolution Partners and walked directly into my 42nd floor executive office. I did not look up immediately from my financial dockets, assuming it was one of my junior analysts, until a deep, perfectly measured, and unmistakably authoritative voice cut through the quiet hum of the room. It takes a very specific, terrifyingly brilliant kind of mind to acquire 3 of the most heavily penalized, financially radioactive logistics companies on the eastern seaboard, merge them into a single Delaware shell corporation, and then somehow convince a 31-year-old amateur to voluntarily sign away his life by legally assuming $42 million of joint and several federal liability. I slowly raised my head, my eyes locking onto a man who looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a sharply tailored navy suit that could not entirely hide the rigid, tactical posture of federal law enforcement, holding a thick red-stamped manila folder in his hands. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold shield, placing it quietly on the edge of my mahogany desk. "Special Agent Jamal Washington, IRS Criminal Investigation Division," he said, his dark eyes analyzing me with a mixture of intense professional scrutiny and quiet, undeniable respect. "I have been tracking the catastrophic tax defaults of Horizon Transit and Ironclad Freight for 18 months, preparing a massive asset seizure, only to wake up last week and find that the entire corporate structure had been legally dissolved, bundled into a new entity called Apex Green Solutions, and instantly transferred to a man named Preston Caldwell." I did not flinch. I did not reach for my phone to call my legal team, and I did not attempt to feign ignorance, because Jamal Washington was clearly not a man who dealt in illusions, and the paper trail I had intentionally left at Sterling Vance's office was specifically designed for an investigator of his caliber to find. "I acquire toxic debt for a living, Agent Washington. It is the fundamental nature of my firm," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my leather chair, gesturing for him to take a seat opposite my desk. "And as for the transfer of ownership, if you review the notary logs and the sworn affidavits filed by Sterling Vance, you will see that I did not convince Preston to take the company. He, along with my parents, aggressively initiated a hostile takeover, coercing me into signing over the entity under the threat of foreclosing on my personal residence." Jamal Washington slowly sat down, a slow, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth as he opened the red-stamped folder, pulling out the exact notarized transfer documents I had signed under duress, documents that completely absolved me of any malicious intent while perfectly cementing Preston's absolute guilt. "I have seen the documents, Miss Caldwell, and I have also seen the wire transfer your father made to Vanguard Capital just hours later, a transfer that effectively proves they were holding your home hostage to force this acquisition," Jamal said softly, tapping a pen against the table, his eyes locking onto mine with a shared, silent understanding of the ruthless game that had just been played. "Your family saw a $50 million valuation on a piece of paper. Their greed completely overrode their basic due diligence, and they bullied you into handing them a ticking time bomb, completely unaware that the IRS was already processing the final foreclosure notices for the legacy debt." The sheer, beautiful irony of the situation hung in the air between us, a silent symphony of absolute justice that required no further explanation, because Jamal Washington knew exactly what I had done, and more importantly, he knew that everything I had done was entirely, perfectly legal. Preston Caldwell is currently using the executive title of that heavily indebted LLC to secure millions of dollars in new, unsecured street loans, fraudulently presenting the company as a solvent tech startup, which elevates this from a simple corporate tax default into massive federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion, Jamal continued, his tone shifting into a cold, professional cadence. "My division is currently coordinating with the FBI and local authorities. We have quietly frozen the underlying banknotes associated with his new accounts, and we are preparing to execute a simultaneous, absolute asset seizure on every single property, account, and vehicle tied to his Social Security number, which, unfortunately for your parents, now includes everything they own, since they enthusiastically co-signed his new lines of credit just 3 days ago." A deep, profound warmth settled into my chest, a feeling of utter, untouchable peace that had eluded me for the past 33 years of my life. The absolute vindication of a woman who had finally stopped begging for respect and simply allowed her abusers to destroy themselves with their own entitlement. "I appreciate the update, Agent Washington," I said quietly, offering him a polite, entirely detached nod. Please ensure that your department executes the law to its fullest, uncompromising extent." He stood up, closing the folder and returning his badge to his pocket, offering me one final respectful glance. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Caldwell. I imagine the next few days are going to be incredibly loud for your family, but something tells me your house will remain perfectly quiet." After he left, the silence of my office felt richer, heavier, and infinitely more satisfying, a stark contrast to the toxic, humiliating charade I was forced to endure later that evening when I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club for my parents' celebratory dinner. The private dining room was draped in heavy velvet and dripping with crystal, filled with 50 of the city's most pretentious, deeply hollow socialites, all raising expensive flutes of champagne to toast my brother, who stood at the head of the long table, his face flushed with arrogance and expensive liquor, of champagne to toast my brother, who stood at the head of the long table, his face flushed with arrogance and expensive liquor, basking in the unearned worship of his peers. My mother had deliberately placed my seat at the very end of the table, near the swinging kitchen doors, a physical manifestation of my assigned status in their hierarchy, and I sat there quietly in a simple, understated charcoal dress, sipping sparkling water, watching the grotesque display of their hubris with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist observing a terminal virus run its course. "To my son, Preston," my father boomed, tapping his spoon against his crystal glass, the sound instantly commanding the room to silence. A true visionary, a man who saw an opportunity to revolutionize the tech industry with Apex Green Solutions and seized it with the kind of aggressive, uncompromising brilliance that the Caldwell name was built upon. The room erupted into polite, sycophantic applause, and Preston raised his glass high, flashing a smug, predatory smile directly at me down the length of the table, entirely convinced that he had shattered my spirit and stolen my future. It takes a lot of late nights and relentless drive to build an empire of this magnitude, but when you have a $50 million valuation backing your vision, the sacrifices are entirely worth it, Preston announced, his voice dripping with faux humility as he adjusted his designer tie. "And I just want to thank my parents for always believing in my genius, and for helping me clear away the minor obstacles that stood in the way of this acquisition." My mother beamed, placing a manicured hand over her heart, while several guests turned to look at me with thinly veiled pity, undoubtedly having been fed a narrative where I was the jealous, incompetent sister who had tried and failed to stand in the way of her brother's inevitable greatness. I did not lower my gaze, I did not frown, and I certainly did not offer them the satisfaction of my tears. Instead, I held Preston's arrogant stare, my expression perfectly smooth, and very slowly raised my water glass in a silent, chilling toast, a gesture that caused a brief, microscopic flicker of confusion to cross his face before his narcissism swiftly erased it. The dinner continued in a blur of clinking silverware, loud, boastful conversations about luxury real estate, and endless, nauseating praise for Preston, while I quietly checked my phone under the table, watching the encrypted alerts from my server monitoring the financial tripwires I had set. At exactly 9:45, as the waiters began clearing the dessert plates and my father signaled for the waiter to bring the astronomically expensive bill for the evening, the first domino finally, violently fell. Preston casually pulled his sleek, heavy metal black card from his wallet, the new corporate credit card he had fraudulently obtained using the Apex Green Solutions LLC documentation, and tossed it onto the silver tray with an arrogant flick of his wrist, not even bothering to look at the total. The waiter nodded subserviently and disappeared toward the main registers. But less than 3 minutes later, the dining room manager, a stern, impeccably dressed man who normally catered to my parents' every whim, walked briskly back to the table, his face pale, holding the black card as if it were coated in poison. He bypassed my father entirely and leaned down next to Preston, his voice low but vibrating with an urgent, poorly concealed panic that instantly drew the attention of the guests sitting nearby. "Mr. Caldwell, I am so sorry to interrupt your celebration, but there appears to be a severe issue with your financial institution," the manager whispered, though the sudden silence in the room made his words echo like a gunshot. "The card was not just declined for insufficient funds. The terminal is displaying a Code 04 federal seizure alert, instructing us to immediately confiscate the physical card and contact local authorities." Preston's smug, flushed face instantly drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, absolute shock, his mouth opening and closing as he stared at the manager in complete disbelief. That is impossible. Run it again. The company is valued at $50 million. The account has a massive line of credit," Preston hissed, his voice cracking, the polished veneer of the tech billionaire shattering instantly to reveal the desperate, panicked fraud underneath. My father quickly stood up, his face reddening with embarrassment as the murmurs of the wealthy guests began to ripple through the room. "There must be some sort of banking error, Preston. Just use your personal card or I will put it on my account. Do not make a scene," Richard commanded, pulling out his own platinum card and aggressively shoving it toward the manager. The manager took my father's card, his hands trembling slightly, and rushed back to the terminal. But the silence in the room had grown heavy, suffocating, and deeply uncomfortable, the illusion of the Caldwell empire suddenly cracking at the foundation. 2 minutes later, the manager returned, accompanied by the general manager of the country club, and this time, there was absolutely no deference or subservience in their posture. "Richard," the general manager said coldly, addressing my father by his first name, a severe breach of protocol that signaled a catastrophic loss of status. "Your card has also triggered a Code 04 federal seizure alert, and my terminal is indicating that your entire portfolio, including your home equity lines and your membership escrow at this club, has been officially locked and frozen by the Internal Revenue Service." The collective gasp from the country club elites was audible, the ultimate devastating social humiliation unfolding in real time beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. My mother let out a sharp, breathless cry, her hand flying to her throat as she stared at my father, who was completely paralyzed, his arrogant posture collapsing as he desperately tried to process the impossible mathematics of his sudden ruin. Preston was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for an escape, until his gaze finally landed on me, sitting quietly at the end of the table. I did not look surprised, I did not look panicked, and I did not move to comfort them. I simply sat in my chair, my hands neatly folded in my lap, watching the exact moment the realization hit my brother's eyes. The horrifying, world-shattering epiphany that the $50 million empire he had stolen was actually a $42 million federal cage, and I had just handed him the padlock. The heavy, suffocating silence that descended upon the private dining room of the Oak Ridge Country Club was not the kind of quiet that follows a simple misunderstanding. It was the absolute terminal silence of an empire collapsing in real time beneath the weight of its own staggering arrogance. My father, Richard Caldwell, a man who had spent the last 30 years cultivating an aura of untouchable financial supremacy, stood frozen at the head of the table, his hand still outstretched toward the general manager, who was currently holding his confiscated platinum card as if it were a piece of highly radioactive evidence. "Richard, I need you and your family to quietly gather your things and exit through the rear service doors," the general manager whispered, his tone entirely devoid of the subservient, polished deference he usually reserved for my parents, replaced instead by the cold, calculating self-preservation of a man who realized he was standing too close to a rapidly sinking ship. "There are federal agents in the valet circle right now. They've already impounded Preston's new Porsche, and they are carrying active asset seizure warrants for every single vehicle and property registered to the Caldwell name." My mother let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, collapsing backward into her velvet upholstered chair, her hands trembling violently as she looked around the lavish room, her eyes silently begging the 50 wealthy socialites for a lifeline. But the elite are notoriously allergic to poverty and federal scandal. They were already turning their heads, whispering behind their linen napkins, actively erasing my parents from their social registry without a second thought. Preston, completely stripped of his arrogant tech billionaire facade, looked like a terrified, cornered child, his breathing shallow and erratic as he practically crawled across the length of the long dining table toward me, knocking over a crystal champagne flute that shattered sharply against the hardwood floor. "Rebecca, what did you do?" he hissed, his voice cracking with a mixture of absolute panic and residual blinding entitlement, genuinely still believing that I was somehow supposed to fix the catastrophic detonation of the bomb he had so eagerly stolen from me. "Call the bank. Call whoever you registered that LLC with and tell them this is a massive mistake. Tell them I am the CEO and I have a guaranteed $50 million valuation." I remained perfectly seated, carefully dabbing the corners of my mouth with my linen napkin before placing it neatly next to my untouched sparkling water, my posture radiating the terrifying, unbothered calm of a woman who was no longer playing a subservient part. "You are the CEO, Preston. That is exactly why this is happening to you," I said softly, my voice carrying effortlessly through the dead quiet of the room, intentionally loud enough for my father's country club friends to hear every single word. "When you and Mom and Dad decided to forge my signature on a $300,000 commercial loan to steal the equity from my home, and then actively extorted me into signing over Apex Green Solutions to clear that fraudulent debt, you didn't bother to read the 50-page prospectus you stole off my laptop." My father's head snapped toward me, the blood draining entirely from his face as the terrifying reality of my words and the very public confession of his felony echoed in front of his peers. "Shut up, Rebecca. Shut your mouth right now," he growled, stepping aggressively toward me with his fists clenched. But he was instantly blocked by the general manager, who quickly raised a hand, signaling 2 large, imposing security guards to step into the dining room. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back. I simply tilted my head, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had treated me like a disposable, low-level asset my entire life. "Apex Green Solutions was never a tech startup, Dad," I explained, my tone clinical and detached, like a senior auditor reading a final, devastating balance sheet. It was a Delaware shell company I specifically created to absorb $42 million in highly toxic, federally penalized commercial trucking debt, complete with a joint and several liability clause that instantly transferred the entirety of that debt to whoever signed on as the sole managing member. Preston let out a guttural, horrifying sound, staggering backward and gripping the edge of the table as his legs finally gave out. The impossible world-ending mathematics of $42 million crushing his chest as he sank to his knees. No, you couldn't do that. You're just a stupid accountant," my mother shrieked, tears of absolute terror streaming down her perfectly contoured face, completely abandoning her polished matriarch persona as she desperately tried to cling to the fragile delusion of my incompetence. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Resolution Partners, Mom," I replied smoothly, standing up from my chair and smoothing the front of my understated charcoal dress. "I liquidate multi-million-dollar fraudulent corporations for a living, and you handed me the perfect, legally bulletproof opportunity to liquidate yours." The heavy oak doors of the private dining room suddenly swung wide open, and Special Agent Jamal Washington stepped inside, flanked by 3 uniformed federal officers, his dark, calculating eyes sweeping the room before locking immediately onto my father and brother. "Preston Caldwell and Richard Caldwell, you are both being detained under federal warrants for massive wire fraud, bank fraud, and severe tax evasion," Agent Washington announced, his voice booming with absolute, uncompromising authority, producing 2 sets of heavy steel handcuffs that caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sheer, undiluted humiliation of the moment was cinematic in its perfection. My father, the arrogant country club king, and my brother, the untouchable golden child, were physically spun around, pushed against the wall, and handcuffed in front of the very people they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress and dominate. My mother was weeping hysterically, dropping to her knees on the expensive carpet, clutching frantically at Agent Washington's suit jacket, begging him to understand that there had been a terrible mistake, that they were a good, wealthy, respectable family, but the agent simply stepped around her, his face a mask of cold, professional indifference. As the officers began to march my father and brother out of the room, Preston twisted his head back, his eyes wide, wild, and pleading, frantically searching my face for the sister who had always sacrificed her peace and her finances to save him from his own disastrous consequences. "Rebecca, please, you have to help me," he screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob that echoed down the marble hallway. I picked up my small clutch purse, stepped calmly around my weeping mother without offering her a single glance of pity, and looked directly into my brother's terrified, tear-filled eyes. "You wanted my house, Preston," I said quietly, the finality of my words hanging in the air like a heavy steel vault slamming shut. "Now you have a federal cell, and I highly suggest you get comfortable in it." I turned and walked out of the dining room, the soft, rhythmic click of my heels echoing through the stunned, silent country club, leaving them completely trapped in the absolute, inescapable devastation they had built with their own two hands. The walk from the private dining room through the grand lobby was a master class in quiet sovereignty, as I moved effortlessly past the whispering patrons and the frantic staff, completely untethered from the chaotic implosion occurring behind me, handing my ticket to the bewildered valet who was standing nervously near a cluster of flashing red and blue federal vehicles. I waited patiently as he retrieved my practical, unassuming sedan, sliding into the driver's seat with a profound sense of lightness that I had never experienced in my entire 33 years of existence. The heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligation finally permanently severed from my neck. When I arrived back at my home in the suburbs, the house was dark, silent, and entirely mine. There were no frantic voicemails on my answering machine, no aggressive text messages demanding my immediate compliance, and no lingering threats of foreclosure hanging over my roof, because Vanguard Capital Partners had officially processed the $300,000 wire transfer my father had sent them, completely clearing the fraudulent lien and returning the deed to my sole possession. I poured myself a single glass of expensive red wine, a vintage I had kept hidden in the back of my pantry for years, because my family would have undoubtedly consumed it without asking, and sat on my back patio, listening to the crickets and feeling the cool night air on my skin, fiercely celebrating the absolute freedom I had just legally secured. The next 48 hours unfolded with the brutal, uncompromising efficiency of a federal prosecution, heavily documented by the local news stations, which gleefully broadcasted the spectacular, incredibly public fall of the Caldwell family, displaying high-definition footage of my father and brother being escorted out of the Oak Ridge Country Club in handcuffs. By Wednesday morning, my heavily encrypted corporate servers at Apex Resolution Partners intercepted the public bankruptcy filings and emergency asset freezes initiated by the IRS, detailing the breathtaking scope of the devastation. My parents' sprawling, heavily mortgaged historic estate was immediately placed under federal seizure due to their arrogant decision to co-sign Preston's fraudulent credit lines. Their luxury vehicles were impounded, and their retirement accounts were completely frozen, pending a deep-level forensic audit of the $42 million in legacy debt attached to Apex Green Solutions. I was sitting at my mahogany desk on the 42nd floor, reviewing a legitimate, highly lucrative merger for a European client, when my private office line rang. My assistant, highly trained to screen all incoming communications, informed me that a frantic, hysterical woman claiming to be my mother was demanding to speak with me from an untraceable prepaid burner phone. I instructed my assistant to patch the call through, pressing the speaker button and leaning back in my leather ergonomic chair, allowing the desperate, ragged sound of Patricia Caldwell's voice to fill the quiet, pristine elegance of my office. "Rebecca, oh my God, Rebecca, you have to help us. You have to tell the feds you tricked us." My mother sobbed, her voice completely devoid of the aristocratic polish she had weaponized against me for decades, reduced to the raw, pathetic panic of a woman who had just spent the night in a cheap motel because she was legally barred from entering her own home. "They took the house. They took your father's accounts. They are keeping Preston in federal lockup without bail because they say he is a massive flight risk with $40 million in debt. You have to call that Agent Washington and tell him you set us up to take the fall." I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee, the ceramic cup making a soft, delicate clink against the saucer, a sound that clearly transmitted over the line, intentionally emphasizing my absolute terrifying calm. "I didn't trick you into doing anything, Mom," I replied, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of any residual pity. "You and Dad conspired with Sterling Vance to forge my signature on a commercial loan. You stole the equity out of my home to pay off Preston's street debts. And then you explicitly, loudly threatened to let the bank foreclose on my house unless I signed over my LLC to Preston." There was a sharp, gasping silence on the other end of the line, the undeniable sound of a lifelong manipulator, realizing that her favorite victim had meticulously documented every single piece of her abuse. "But you knew it was a trap. You knew that company was full of debt, you evil, vindictive bitch. You set your own brother up to be destroyed," she screamed, the venom returning to her voice, proving once and for all that her tears were never about remorse, but entirely about the sudden, shocking loss of her own unearned comfort. "I simply built a mirror, Mom," I said quietly, cutting through her hysterics with surgical, devastating precision. "I built a mirror out of paper and federal debt, and I left it on the living room table. I didn't force Preston to steal my files. I didn't force you to forge my name. And I didn't force Dad to arrogantly demand the CEO title for a company he didn't bother to research. You all looked into that mirror, saw exactly what your greed wanted to see, and you destroyed yourselves because of your own unchecked, insatiable entitlement." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't listen to the inevitable barrage of curses, threats, and demands. I simply reached forward and pressed the glowing red button on my console, disconnecting the call and permanently severing the final rotting tether that bound me to the Caldwell name. However, as I turned my chair to look out at the sprawling, sunlit city below, feeling the initial beautiful wave of absolute peace wash over my shoulders, my private cell phone, the one highly encrypted number my family absolutely did not have, suddenly buzzed on my desk with an urgent incoming text message. It was a secure, automated alert from my personal home security system in the suburbs, notifying me that a vehicle had just breached the perimeter of my driveway, and as I quickly tapped the screen to access the live exterior camera feed, I did not see my weeping mother or my defeated father. I saw Victor Vance, the sharply dressed, ruthless underground loan shark who had been aggressively terrorizing my brother, stepping out of a heavily tinted black SUV and walking slowly toward my front door, holding the printed, fabricated Apex Green Solutions $50 million prospectus in his hand, proving that while the federal government had successfully taken my brother's freedom, the criminal underground had just arrived to collect the debt from the only Caldwell who actually possessed the capital to pay. The glowing screen of my security feed illuminated the quiet darkness of my home office as I watched Victor Vance, a man whose reputation for ruthless underground debt collection was well known even in the legitimate financial circles of the city, step onto my front porch holding the printed, fabricated Apex Green Solutions $50 million prospectus in his hand. He did not look like a street-level thug. He wore a meticulously tailored charcoal gray Italian suit, an expensive silk tie, and carried himself with the quiet, predatory stillness of a man who rarely had to raise his voice to get exactly what he wanted. He reached out and pressed the doorbell, the soft chime echoing through my empty, peaceful house, a sound that would have sent my brother Preston into a spiraling, hyperventilating panic. But sitting in my ergonomic leather chair, I simply felt the cold, familiar rush of adrenaline that always accompanied a high-stakes negotiation. Before I tell you exactly how I handled one of the city's most dangerous loan sharks standing on my doorstep in the middle of the night, please let me know down in the comments if you have ever been forced to clean up a terrifying, dangerous mess created by a family member who absolutely refused to take responsibility for their own destructive actions. I did not call the police, nor did I pretend I was not home, because men like Victor Vance did not respect avoidance. They only respected power, leverage, and absolute unflinching eye contact. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my simple linen trousers, walked calmly down the hallway, and pulled open the heavy reinforced oak door, stepping out onto the porch to face him, deliberately keeping the security door locked behind me to establish a firm physical boundary. Victor looked at me, his dark eyes scanning my face for any sign of the typical, frantic terror he was accustomed to seeing when he arrived unannounced at the homes of his debtors' relatives. "Miss Caldwell?" he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that carried a subtle, unmistakable edge of violence. "I apologize for the late hour, but your brother Preston owes me a very substantial amount of money, $400,000 to be exact, and since he is currently sitting in a federal holding cell and your parents' entire estate has been seized by the IRS, you are the only Caldwell left who possesses the capital to settle his tab." He slowly raised the heavy leather binder containing the $50 million prospectus, tapping the embossed cover with a manicured finger. "Preston assured me that you built this company, that it was a massive tech valuation, and he tried to offer me an equity stake in exchange for forgiving his debt. But seeing as how he is now facing federal wire fraud charges, I am no longer interested in equity. I am here for my money, and I know you have it." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact, and I certainly did not offer him a frantic, desperate apology on behalf of my family. "Victor, may I call you Victor?" I asked softly, my voice perfectly level, carrying the authoritative, icy calm of a woman who routinely dismantled corporate empires before lunch. "You are a businessman who deals in risk assessment, which means you are usually smart enough to verify an asset before you accept it as collateral. But my brother is a pathological liar, and he played you for an absolute fool." Victor's jaw tightened, a dangerous, dark shadow crossing his face as he took a half step closer to the door, his physical intimidation tactics automatically kicking in. "I would be very careful with your next words, Miss Caldwell, because I am not a federal agent and I do not require a courtroom to collect what is owed to me." I offered him a small, cold, entirely humorless smile, pulling my encrypted smartphone from my pocket and tapping a few keys to bypass the security firewalls, bringing up the actual, heavily redacted federal filings for Apex Green Solutions, LLC. I held the screen up to the glass of the door, ensuring the brightness was turned all the way up so he could clearly read the bold red federal stamps covering the document. "Look closely at the screen, Victor," I commanded quietly. Apex Green Solutions is not a tech startup. It has no artificial intelligence algorithm, and it certainly does not have a $50 million valuation. It is a Delaware shell company that I personally engineered to act as a liability vacuum. I watched his eyes scan the screen, tracking the exact moment his confident, predatory demeanor completely shattered, replaced by a profound, chilling shock as he read the numbers. "The company you are holding in your hand contains exactly $42 million in defaulted commercial trucking debt, massive EPA penalties, and federal tax liens. And when my brother aggressively stole that company from me, he legally assumed every single cent of that debt." I lowered the phone, locking my eyes back onto his. If you had accepted an equity stake in that LLC, the Internal Revenue Service would have automatically attached that $42 million federal lien to your personal Social Security number. They would have audited your entire underground operation, and you would be sitting in the cell right next to my brother by noon tomorrow. Preston didn't offer you a payoff, Victor. He unknowingly handed you a federal death sentence. The silence on the porch was absolute, heavy with the terrifying realization of how close Victor had just come to losing his entire empire because he trusted the frantic promises of a spoiled, entitled degenerate. He looked down at the leather binder in his hand as if it were coated in anthrax, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges, a slow, simmering rage replacing the shock in his eyes. "He owes me $400,000, Victor repeated, his voice dropping into a lethal, venomous whisper, "and I do not walk away empty-handed." I nodded slowly, acknowledging the reality of his business model, because I understood the mathematics of debt better than anyone. I will not pay a single cent of my brother's gambling debts, because his choices are his own, and my money is entirely protected behind corporate veils that you cannot penetrate, I stated firmly, drawing the ultimate impenetrable boundary. However, I do not want you returning to my property, so I am going to offer you a piece of highly classified, actionable intelligence that will allow you to recoup your $400,000 before the sun comes up. Victor's eyes narrowed, his predatory instincts re-engaging as he listened carefully. My father, Richard Caldwell, is a deeply arrogant man, but he is also profoundly paranoid, I explained, leaning slightly closer to the glass. When the federal government seized his estate tonight, they froze all of his known domestic accounts and impounded his vehicles. But what they do not know is that my father maintains a private, unregistered safety deposit box at the secure vault facility on Fifth Avenue, registered under my mother's maiden name to bypass standard banking audits. I tapped my phone again, pulling up a scanned document and pressing it against the glass. Inside box 402, there is a collection of unregistered bearer bonds, uncut diamonds, and vintage Patek Philippe watches worth approximately $600,000. It was his ultimate emergency fund, completely off the books. I watched Victor process the information, the cold calculus of the streets running rapidly through his mind as he realized the incredible value of what I was handing him. "Why are you giving this to me?" he asked quietly, genuine curiosity cutting through his anger. "Because they stole from me. They tried to destroy my sanctuary, and I want them to have absolutely nothing left when the dust settles," I replied. My voice devoid of any emotion, a pure, terrifying statement of fact. "You take your $400,000, you keep the extra $200,000 for your trouble, and you never, ever step foot on my property or contact me again." Victor stared at me for a long, heavy moment, a look of profound, undeniable respect washing over his face as he realized he was not dealing with a frightened civilian, but with a woman whose capacity for ruthless, calculated destruction vastly exceeded his own. He slowly lowered the leather binder, gave me a sharp, brief nod of agreement, turned on his heel, and walked back to his black SUV, disappearing into the night to completely drain the absolute last remaining drop of my parents' wealth. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying metallic finality, and I slept that night with a deep, uninterrupted peace that I had not felt since childhood. The following morning, the absolute crushing reality of the Caldwell family's annihilation dominated the local news cycle, with every major financial blog and morning broadcast detailing the spectacular federal raid at the Oak Ridge Country Club and the staggering $42 million fraud allegations leveled against my brother and father. I arrived at my office at Apex Resolution Partners at 7:30, dressed in a flawless, immaculately tailored navy blue St. John knit suit, my hair styled perfectly, finally shedding the frumpy, exhausted disguise I had worn for my family, and fully embracing the armor of the multi-million-dollar CEO I actually was. At 9:15, my private intercom buzzed, and my assistant, her voice tight with a mixture of professional concern and utter disbelief, informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother was in the 42nd floor lobby, causing a massive, hysterical scene, demanding to be let through security because she was the mother of the owner. I did not sigh. I did not panic. I simply instructed my assistant to escort Patricia Caldwell directly into my executive office, fully prepared to deliver the final lethal blow to the decaying corpse of our relationship. The heavy glass doors swung open and my mother stumbled into the room, and the sight of her was almost jarring in its absolute devastation. Patricia Caldwell, a woman who had never left her house without a full face of flawless makeup, a blowout, and a designer handbag, was currently wearing yesterday's wrinkled country club dress. Her hair was a tangled, chaotic mess, and her face was swollen and raw from hours of hysterical crying. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she crossed the threshold, her tear-filled eyes widening in absolute paralyzing shock as she took in the breathtaking scale of my reality. The massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city's skyline, the expansive mahogany desk, the priceless abstract art on the walls, and the dozen junior analysts working quietly in the glass-walled bullpen outside my door. For decades, she had genuinely believed I was a struggling, low-level accountant sitting in a gray cubicle and seeing the undeniable physical proof of my immense wealth and power completely short-circuited her brain. "Rebecca," she breathed, her voice trembling as she looked at my designer suit, the heavy gold Cartier watch on my wrist, and the cold, entirely unbothered expression on my face. You own all of this? This whole firm?" I did not stand up to greet her, nor did I offer her a chair. I remained seated, leaning back and resting my hands on the desk. "I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Resolution Partners." "Yes," I replied calmly, the words echoing loudly in the cavernous office. The shock on her face was almost instantly replaced by a sudden, sickening surge of desperate, ravenous greed, a terrifying testament to her fundamentally broken psychology. Even standing in the absolute ruins of her life, her first instinct was to figure out how to extract value from me. She rushed forward, slamming her hands down on my desk, her eyes wild with a frantic, manufactured hope. "Oh my God, Rebecca, you have millions! You have the money to fix this!" she cried, a deranged, hysterical smile breaking across her face. "You have to call your legal team. You have to post bail for Preston and your father. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country and pay off that federal lien. We can get the house back. We can fix everything. You can save the family." I looked at her, observing the absolute staggering lack of accountability, the breathtaking entitlement of a mother who had literally just participated in the theft of my home equity, currently demanding that I use my hidden fortune to rescue the very people who had tried to destroy me. "I am not spending a single dime of my money to save men who arrogantly walk themselves into a federal cage," I said softly, my voice cutting through her hysterical demands like a scalpel. "The assets of this firm are protected, and you will not see a single cent of it." Her deranged smile instantly vanished, replaced by a vicious, ugly snarl, the mask of the loving mother completely dissolving to reveal the toxic, parasitic reality underneath. "You ungrateful, selfish bitch!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she pounded her fist against my desk. "We are your family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us your loyalty. You owe us your respect. And you will not sit in this glass tower while your blood rots in a prison cell." I stared at her, feeling absolutely no anger, no sadness, only the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor finalizing a terminal account. "You want to talk about what I owe you, Mom?" I asked quietly, opening the locked side drawer of my desk and pulling out a faded, yellowing manila folder that I had retrieved from my secure home safe that morning. "Let us talk about what this family owes me." I opened the folder and slowly slid a fragile 20-year-old notarized document across the polished mahogany surface, stopping it right in front of her trembling hands. It was not a document related to the recent $300,000 forgery. It was a deeply buried, meticulously hidden financial ledger that I had uncovered years ago when I first gained high-level access to the federal banking archives, a secret I had held onto in absolute silence, waiting for the precise moment when the truth would inflict the maximum possible damage. This is the irrevocable trust fund established by my grandmother, Eleanor, when I was 10 years old, I explained, my voice echoing with a chilling historical weight as I watched my mother's face completely drain of whatever color she had left. A trust fund that was specifically legally designated entirely for my college education and my future, containing exactly $150,000. I tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the second page of the document, highlighting a series of aggressive, unauthorized withdrawals. But when I turned 18 and I asked Dad for the funds to pay for my university tuition, he looked me directly in the eye and told me that the stock market had crashed, that grandmother's investments had failed, and that the money was entirely gone. My mother stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating terror as the ghosts of her past sins resurrected in the brightly lit office. I spent 4 years working 3 jobs, taking night shifts and burying myself in student loan debt just to survive, completely believing that the money had vanished through bad luck. I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly, uncompromising register. But the market didn't crash, Mom. The records clearly show that 3 months before my 18th birthday, you and Dad illegally liquidated the entire trust, draining every single cent, and used my grandmother's money to pay for Preston's exorbitant tuition at that elite private boarding school he ended up getting expelled from, and to finance your kitchen remodel. The heavy, terrifying silence in the room was absolute. The final, undeniable proof that their betrayal was not a recent phenomenon born of sudden desperation, but a foundational, decades-long system of financial and emotional treason, a system where my future was always entirely disposable if it meant securing Preston's comfort. You didn't just forge my name last week, I whispered, closing the folder with a sharp, echoing snap that made her violently flinch. You have been stealing from me since I was a child. You stole my inheritance. You stole my peace. You stole my house. And you genuinely believed I would never be smart enough to catch you. I watched her chest heave, the absolute paralyzing realization setting in that I was not just prosecuting them for the crimes of the present, but for the unforgivable financial treason they had committed against me 20 years ago. And as she slowly sank into one of my leather guest chairs, weeping uncontrollably into her hands, I reached for my desk phone, ready to summon security to permanently remove the last remaining piece of the Caldwell rot from my empire. My finger pressed down on the glowing red intercom button on my console, the small mechanical click sounding like the final definitive swing of an executioner's axe in the cavernous silence of my executive office. Yes, Miss Caldwell, my assistant's voice chimed instantly, professional and completely composed, entirely unaffected by the hysterical weeping of the woman sitting across from me. Please send the primary security detail up to my office immediately, I instructed, my tone flat, even, and entirely devoid of any familial hesitation. I have a trespasser who needs to be escorted out of the building, and under no circumstances is she to be allowed past the lobby ever again. Patricia Caldwell, the woman who had spent the last 33 years demanding my absolute obedience, while secretly funding my brother's delusions with my stolen inheritance, gasped violently, her tear-streaked face snapping up to look at me in absolute paralyzing horror. You are calling security on your own mother? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, lingering entitlement, genuinely unable to comprehend that the invisible, unbreakable tether of my compliance had finally snapped. I did not answer her. I simply closed the 20-year-old yellowing manila folder containing the undeniable proof of her financial treason, slid it carefully back into the locked drawer of my mahogany desk, and folded my hands in front of me, watching her with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing the final, pathetic spasms of a dying parasite. Less than 45 seconds later, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open, and two massive, impeccably dressed security guards, former military contractors I paid exceptionally well to maintain the absolute sanctity of my firm, stepped into the room, their eyes locking onto my mother with cold, uncompromising authority. "Ma'am, you need to come with us right now," the lead guard said, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation as he stepped toward her. For a fraction of a second, the aristocratic country club matriarch tried to reassert herself, Patricia instinctively straightening her spine and opening her mouth to issue a harsh reprimand. But the reality of her ruined dress, her smeared makeup, and the absolute destruction of her empire crushed the impulse before it could even materialize. She looked at the guards, then looked back at me, her eyes wide, hollow, and filled with the terrifying realization that she possessed absolutely no power in this glass tower, and that the daughter she had treated as a disposable asset was now the untouchable architect of her ruin. "You are going to burn in hell for this, Rebecca," she hissed, her voice dripping with a venomous, toxic hatred that finally completely stripped away the suffocating illusion of maternal love I had desperately clung to for most of my life. "You will die alone, and no one will ever love you because you are a cold, unnatural, vindictive monster." I held her furious gaze, feeling absolutely no sting from her words, only a profound, beautiful sense of liberation. I would rather sit alone in a fortress of my own making than spend another second drowning in the shallow, toxic puddle of your conditional love, I replied smoothly, nodding to the guards. They did not give her the opportunity to speak again. They flanked her, gripping her arms firmly but professionally, and physically escorted her out of my office, her expensive heels dragging slightly against the plush carpet as she began to sob uncontrollably once more, the sound fading into the distance as the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind her. The silence that instantly reclaimed my office was immaculate, heavy, and deeply restorative. The kind of absolute peace that can only be achieved when you finally surgically remove a rotting appendage that has been poisoning your bloodstream for decades. I sat at my desk for a long moment looking out at the sprawling, sunlit city skyline, allowing the adrenaline to slowly metabolize out of my system before I calmly reached for the next corporate restructuring docket on my desk and seamlessly transitioned back into my work, because unlike the Caldwell family, my empire was built on actual, tangible labor, not illusions and stolen equity. The rest of the afternoon passed with ruthless, highly profitable efficiency, the kind of hyper-focused productivity that had allowed me to quietly amass a fortune while my family was busy applauding Preston's fabricated achievements. It was not until just after 6 o'clock in the evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and cast long, golden shadows across my office, that the absolute devastation I had unleashed upon my family reached out to touch me one final time for the day. My private, highly encrypted personal cell phone, the number I had never given to anyone in my family, suddenly began to vibrate against the mahogany surface of my desk, displaying an incoming call from an unknown restricted federal number. I knew exactly who it was, and I answered it out of pure, morbid, psychological fascination. "This is a prepaid call from a federal detention facility," an automated, sterile voice announced. "The caller is Preston Caldwell. To accept the charges, press 1. I pressed the button, leaning back in my chair and waiting for the sound of my brother's voice, fully expecting a barrage of the same arrogant, entitled screaming he had subjected me to at the restaurant just over 2 weeks ago. But the voice that came through the receiver was entirely unrecognizable. "Rebecca? Oh my God, Rebecca, please don't hang up. Please tell me you are there," Preston begged, his voice a frantic, high-pitched, hyperventilating whisper that echoed terribly against what sounded like solid cinder block walls. He was terrified, utterly broken, the polished veneer of the tech visionary completely obliterated by the brutal, uncompromising reality of federal lockup. "I am here, Preston," I said softly, my voice perfectly level, giving him absolutely nothing to anchor his panic to. "What do you want?" He let out a ragged, pathetic sob, a sound that would have previously sent me rushing to my checkbook to fix whatever catastrophic mess he had made, but now simply registered as background noise. "They are talking about 20 years, Rebecca. They have me in a cell with men who terrify me. And the federal prosecutor came in here 3 hours ago and told my public defender that they have the paperwork showing I accepted $42 million in fraudulent debt." He babbled, the words pouring out of him in a desperate, unstructured torrent. "They seized Dad's accounts. They took the house. They took my car. There was absolutely no money left for bail. You are the only one who can get me out of here." I listened to the sheer, breathtaking narcissism of his plea. Even now, facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive financial crimes, his fundamental worldview had not shifted. He still genuinely believed that I existed solely to serve as his emergency parachute. And why exactly would I use my capital to post your bail, Preston, when you explicitly conspired with our parents to steal the equity from my home to pay off your illegal street debts? I asked, keeping my tone clinical, forcing him to confront the exact mechanics of his own treason. There was a brief, frantic pause on the line, the sound of his desperately spinning mind trying to calculate a way out of the corner he had painted himself into. "Because I can give you Dad!" Preston suddenly blurted out, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, venomous whisper, proving in a fraction of a second that he possessed absolutely no loyalty to anyone but himself. "I will testify against them, Rebecca. I will tell the feds that Dad organized the whole thing. I will tell them Mom forged your signature. I will tell them they bullied me into taking that LLC, and I didn't know what was in it. I will completely roll on them if you just pay my bail and get me the hell out of this place." The absolute, sickening depravity of his offer hung in the air between us, a stark, undeniable confirmation of the Caldwell family's true moral rot. The golden child, the son my parents had literally sacrificed my future, my inheritance, and my home to protect, was enthusiastically offering to send them both to federal prison for the rest of their lives in exchange for a comfortable bed and a warm meal. It was the ultimate, poetic justice, a betrayal so deeply ingrained in his character that it was almost beautiful to witness. "You would sell out the parents who literally stole my inheritance to pay for your boarding school?" I asked quietly, ensuring I had the full measure of his treachery. "They ruined my life, Rebecca. They set me up to fail," he screamed defensively, completely rewriting history to cast himself as the victim of the very people who had worshipped him. "Just wire the money to the bondsman, please. I will do whatever you want." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the gavel in my hand. "Here is the mathematical reality of your situation, Preston," I stated, my voice dropping into a cold, absolute register that commanded the line. "Your bail has been set at $5 million due to the extreme flight risk associated with a $42 million fraud charge. And even if I wanted to pull that kind of liquidity from my protected assets, which I absolutely do not, the federal government would immediately seize it the second it hit the bondsman's account, because they are actively auditing every single financial connection to your name." He started to cry again, realizing the walls were rapidly closing in. No, you are a CEO. Mom told me you have a massive firm. You have lawyers. You can fix this," he wailed, his voice cracking in sheer desperation. "I am a CEO who liquidates toxic, fraudulent assets, Preston," I corrected him smoothly. "And as far as I am concerned, you are the most toxic asset this family ever produced, and I have officially wiped you off my balance sheet. Do not ever call this number again." I ended the call, blocking the facility's exchange in my phone settings, leaving him entirely alone in the dark, terrifying reality he had so arrogantly claimed as his own empire. I packed up my briefcase, the satisfaction of the day settling deeply into my bones, and took my private elevator down to the VIP executive parking garage located beneath the glass tower. The garage was quiet, dimly lit, and usually completely empty at this hour, my practical sedan sitting alone in my reserved spot near the exit gates. As I walked toward my vehicle, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoing off the concrete pillars, a shadow suddenly detached itself from the gloom near my car, causing my highly honed situational awareness to instantly spike. I did not freeze, and I did not panic. I simply slipped my right hand into my coat pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around the high-voltage tactical stun gun I carried precisely for moments like this, and stopped 10 feet away from the figure. It was Sterling Vance, the corrupt country club golfing notary who had illegally authorized the forgery of my home loan and eagerly facilitated the fraudulent corporate takeover of Apex Green Solutions, was standing near my driver's side door. But he looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, polished attorney who had sneered at me just 2 weeks prior. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie was loosened and crooked, his face was pale and slick with a terrified sweat, and he was clutching a small leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a life preserver. "Miss Caldwell, please." "Do not call security. I just need 5 minutes of your time," Sterling begged, his voice trembling violently, his eyes darting around the empty garage in absolute paranoia. "I know I have no right to approach you like this, but the IRS Criminal Investigation Division raided my law firm 3 hours ago. They took all my servers, they seized my client logs, they froze my operating accounts, and Special Agent Washington told me I am facing 20 years for facilitating federal wire fraud." I kept my hand firmly on my weapon, my expression an impenetrable mask of cold indifference. "You authorized a forged signature on a $300,000 commercial loan, Sterling, and then you drafted the legal documents to transfer $42 million in toxic federal debt to a man who didn't even know how to read a balance sheet," I reminded him quietly. "You are not facing 20 years for facilitating fraud. You are facing 20 years for being the primary legal architect of it." He flinched as if I had physically struck him, taking a desperate half-step forward before stopping himself. "I didn't know about the toxic debt, Rebecca. I swear to God I didn't know what was in that LLC. Your father just told me it was a quick tech transfer. He played me," Sterling pleaded, his voice cracking with the exact same pathetic, blame-shifting cowardice my brother had just exhibited on the phone. "I have a family. I have a practice. I cannot go to federal prison for Richard Caldwell's arrogance." I looked at him, feeling absolutely no pity for a man who had willingly participated in the attempted theft of my sanctuary just because my father bought him expensive scotch at the country club. "Then you should have engaged in standard due diligence instead of blindly stamping documents for your golfing buddies," I replied coldly. "What exactly do you want from me, Sterling?" He swallowed hard, nervously opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a small, encrypted black flash drive, holding it out toward me with trembling fingers. "I am a paranoid man, Miss Caldwell. I record every single meeting that takes place in my primary conference room for liability purposes, completely off the books," he whispered, his eyes wide with desperate negotiation. "I have the unedited, high-definition audio and video files of your parents sitting in my office 3 days before that dinner, explicitly planning the forgery of your signature, openly discussing the theft of your home equity, and laughing about how they drained your grandmother's trust fund 20 years ago to pay for Preston's boarding school." My eyes locked onto the small black drive, the absolute, undeniable holy grail of my vindication resting right in the palm of his sweating hand. "I will give you the drive, I will give you the unredacted digital master files, and you can use it to completely bury them, to prove absolute malice aforethought, ensuring they never see the light of day again." Sterling bargained, his voice frantic. "All I ask in return is that you call Agent Washington and tell him that I was an unwitting victim, that you believe I was manipulated by your father. Just give me a character reference so I can negotiate a plea deal and keep my law license." I stared at the man who had sat in a room and watched my parents plot my financial execution, currently trying to sell their rotting corpses to save his own skin, and a slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile touched the corners of my mouth. I stepped forward, smoothly plucking the black flash drive from his trembling fingers, slipping it securely into my briefcase before stepping back. "I will make sure Agent Washington receives this drive, Sterling," I said softly, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed lethally in the quiet garage. "But I will not lie to the federal government for you. You knew exactly what you were doing when you stamped that forged deed, and you deserve every single second of the sentence you are about to receive." His eyes widened in absolute horrifying realization as I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut and leaving him standing completely alone in the dark, holding an empty briefcase, knowing with absolute certainty that the Caldwell family's destruction was not just complete, but heavily, irrevocably documented. The drive back to the suburbs was accompanied only by the soft, rhythmic hum of my tires against the pavement and the heavy, undeniable weight of the encrypted black flash drive resting in the passenger seat of my practical sedan, a small piece of plastic that contained the absolute, unedited digital execution of the Caldwell family legacy. I did not speed. I did not turn on the radio, and I did not allow myself to feel a single ounce of preemptive guilt for what I was about to do, because guilt was a luxury reserved for those who had accidentally caused harm, and every single action my parents and my brother had taken against me over the last 33 years had been executed with breathtaking, calculated malice. When I finally pulled into the quiet sanctuary of my driveway, the motion sensor lights bathing my property in a warm, secure glow, I walked straight into my home office, bypassed my standard firewall protocols, and immediately uploaded the raw audio and video files from Sterling Vance's corrupt law practice directly onto a secure, untraceable cloud server, setting a time-delayed, automated email that would forward the entire unredacted cache of evidence to Special Agent Jamal Washington at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. I poured myself a second glass of the vintage red wine I had opened the night before, savoring the complex, dark notes of the expensive blend as I sat in the darkness of my living room, watching the local midnight news broadcast on silent, reading the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen that proudly announced the widening federal investigation into the $42 million Apex Green Solutions fraud syndicate. By the time the sun rose, painting the suburban sky in brilliant streaks of gold and violet, the intricate lethal machinery I had set into motion had already completed its final devastating cycle, a reality I confirmed when I opened my encrypted laptop to review the morning Financial Wire intercepts. According to the dark web chatter and the subtle shifts in the underground credit markets that my firm routinely monitored, Victor Vance had not wasted a single second after leaving my porch. He had leveraged his extensive criminal network to quietly bypass the biometric security at the Fifth Avenue Vault facility long before the federal agents even thought to look for a safety deposit box registered under my mother's maiden name. Victor had successfully extracted every single uncut diamond, unregistered bearer bond, and vintage Patek Philippe watch my father had hoarded as his ultimate untraceable emergency fund, completely draining the $600,000 of hidden liquidity and leaving behind nothing but an empty metal box and a profound, terrifying void for a man who had suddenly lost his entire empire. My father, Richard Caldwell, a man who had spent 3 decades sneering at poverty and demanding absolute subservience from everyone in his orbit, was now mathematically, undeniably destitute, stripped of his country club memberships, his sprawling historic estate, and the secret financial parachute he had spent years ruthlessly building behind my mother's back. At precisely 9:15 that morning, as I sat at the marble island in my kitchen enjoying a quiet, uninterrupted cup of French roast coffee, my secure cell phone rang, displaying the direct unlisted desk number of Special Agent Jamal Washington at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell," Agent Washington said, his deep, authoritative voice carrying a rare, undeniable edge of profound professional astonishment. I arrived at my office this morning to find a highly encrypted, anonymous email containing high-definition video files of Sterling Vance, Richard Caldwell, and Patricia Caldwell actively conspiring to commit federal bank fraud, identity theft, and corporate espionage, completely invalidating any potential defense they might have attempted to mount regarding the Apex Green Solutions transfer. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warm ceramic of the mug grounding me in the beautiful, quiet reality of my kitchen. "That sounds like a devastating piece of evidence for their legal teams to navigate, Agent Washington," I replied smoothly, my tone reflecting nothing but mild, detached civic interest. "It is the kind of evidence that takes a 20-year sentence and legally upgrades it to a permanent, unassailable federal mandate," Jamal countered, a hint of dark amusement slipping into his professional cadence. "Sterling Vance is currently sitting in an interrogation room, sweating through his custom suit, aggressively trying to negotiate a plea deal that no longer exists because we already possess the exact leverage he was trying to sell us. Your father's emergency bail hearing has been permanently revoked due to the newly established premeditation of the forgery, and your brother is currently being transferred to a maximum security holding facility pending his arraignment on the $42 million toxic debt assumption." He paused for a long, heavy moment, the silence on the line vibrating with the unspoken acknowledgement of the terrifying, flawless architecture of the trap I had built. "You didn't just lock the door on them, Rebecca. You welded it shut and threw the entire building into the ocean. They are never getting out from under this." I looked around my pristine, sunlit home, the sanctuary they had arrogantly tried to steal to fund their golden child's gambling addictions, and felt the final, lingering shadows of my traumatic childhood simply evaporate into the morning air. "They built their own cage, Agent Washington. I simply provided the blueprints and the raw materials," I said quietly, ending the call and placing the phone face down on the marble counter, officially closing the chapter on my active participation in their destruction. However, the dying gasps of a toxic patriarchy are rarely silent, and precisely 3 hours later, the heavy, frantic pounding on my reinforced front door shattered the peaceful tranquility of my afternoon, the violent rhythmic thudding signaling the arrival of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I checked the live feed on my security monitors and saw my father, Richard Caldwell, standing on my porch, his appearance so drastically degraded that he was almost entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, polished aristocrat who had tried to force a silver pen into my hand at the Michelin-starred restaurant just weeks prior. He was wearing the same wrinkled, sweat-stained dress shirt from the country club raid. His face was covered in a rough, uneven layer of graying stubble, and his eyes were wild, bloodshot, and completely unhinged, vibrating with the desperate, frantic energy of an apex predator who had suddenly realized he was at the absolute bottom of the food chain. I knew he had likely drained the very last of his legitimate, non-frozen checking accounts to secure a predatory 24-hour emergency bond just to get out of holding, and instead of using his temporary freedom to secure legal counsel, his deeply ingrained narcissistic entitlement had driven him straight to my doorstep, fully expecting me to bow to his authority one final time. I did not cower, I did not call the police, and I did not pretend I was not home. I calmly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open, leaving the reinforced steel security screen locked between us, a physical and psychological barrier that perfectly represented the new, permanent dynamics of our relationship. "Rebecca!" Richard gasped, his hands gripping the metal mesh of the security door, his breath fogging the glass behind it as he stared at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and pathetic, begging desperation. "You have to let me in. The feds took the house, they took the cars. I went to the Fifth Avenue vault this morning to get my emergency funds, and the box was completely empty. Somebody cleared it out. I have absolutely nothing. I stood exactly 3 feet back from the door, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting easily in the pockets of my tailored linen trousers, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable sovereignty. I am aware the box is empty, Dad, I stated calmly, my voice devoid of any warmth, pity, or filial piety. I gave Victor Vance the location and the access codes last night. He collected the $400,000 Preston owed him, and he kept the remaining $200,000 as a convenience fee for never stepping foot on my property again. The words hit him with the physical force of a freight train, his eyes widening in absolute horrifying comprehension as his knees visibly buckled, his hands sliding down the metal mesh of the door as the crushing reality of my orchestration fully materialized in his mind. You gave my money to a street thug?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, broken wheeze, his brain completely unable to process the fact that the quiet, subservient daughter he had relentlessly mocked for being a low-level accountant had systematically dismantled his entire secret financial life in less than 12 hours. "It wasn't your money, Richard," I corrected him, using his first name with deliberate, lethal precision, permanently stripping him of the patriarchal title he had weaponized against me for my entire life. "It was the money you stole from my grandmother's trust fund, the money you actively hoarded while you forced me to work 3 jobs to pay for my own education, the money you hid while you allowed Mom to forge my name to steal the equity out of the only sanctuary I have ever owned." His face twisted into an ugly, desperate mask of rage, the ingrained habit of domination violently fighting against the overwhelming evidence of his absolute defeat. "I am your father," he screamed, his voice echoing off the quiet suburban houses, spit flying from his lips and hitting the security screen. "I gave you life. I gave you the Caldwell name. You owe me everything, you ungrateful, vindictive little bitch. I demand that you open this door and give me the money to fix this." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't flinch away from his aggression, and I didn't offer him the satisfaction of seeing a single ounce of my pain. I simply tilted my head, looking at the broken, destitute man standing on my porch with the cold, clinical detachment of a sovereign queen surveying a banished traitor. The Caldwell name is currently synonymous with a $42 million federal fraud indictment, so you can keep it, I replied, my voice a soft, lethal whisper that cut effortlessly through his screaming. "You gave me nothing but 20 years of financial abuse, emotional neglect, and a front-row seat to the absolute mediocrity of your golden child. And as of this exact moment, you are legally, financially, and permanently dead to me." I took a single step forward, bringing my face mere inches from the steel mesh, forcing him to look directly into the cold, dead eyes of the monster he had created. "If you ever step foot on my property again, if you ever attempt to contact me, or if you even look in my general direction, I will personally hand the IRS the secondary ledgers documenting the offshore accounts you hid from Mom during your brief separation in 2008. I lied smoothly, having absolutely no idea if such accounts existed, but knowing his inherent paranoia and lifetime of deceit would immediately accept the bluff as absolute terrifying fact. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, his jaw dropping open in silent, paralyzing terror as the bluff landed flawlessly, completely breaking the last fragile remnant of his fighting spirit. He stumbled backward off the porch, tripping over his own expensive, scuffed leather shoes, his hands shaking violently as he looked at me, not as a daughter, but as an omnipotent, terrifying force of nature that had completely, utterly destroyed him. "Goodbye, Richard," I said softly, and before he could formulate a single word of defense or apology, I pushed the heavy oak door shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a resounding, metallic finality that echoed through the quiet house like the closing of a massive vault. I walked away from the door, leaving him standing alone in the driveway to face the absolute ruin of his own making. And as I walked back into my sunlit kitchen, my encrypted laptop chimed with a priority email notification from the legal department of Apex Resolution Partners, officially confirming that the complete unconditional transfer of all toxic liability away from my firm and onto the Caldwell family was now a permanent matter of federal public record. The autumn arrived with a crisp, cleansing chill that seemed to seamlessly sweep the final, lingering remnants of the Caldwell family's toxic legacy entirely out of the city, replacing the chaotic, suffocating humidity of the summer with a profound, unyielding clarity that perfectly mirrored the new, permanent trajectory of my existence. Over the next 6 months, the federal justice system processed the staggering $42 million Apex Green Solutions fraud with the kind of ruthless, uncompromising efficiency that completely dismantled the arrogant illusion of invincibility my parents had spent their entire lives desperately constructing. Special Agent Jamal Washington did not offer quiet settlements, sympathetic leniency, or backroom plea deals. Utilizing the unredacted high-definition audio and video files I had anonymously provided from Sterling Vance's corrupt servers, the prosecution systematically annihilated every single legal defense my father attempted to mount, presenting a case so structurally flawless that the presiding federal judge actually openly reprimanded the defense counsel for wasting the court's time. Preston, the golden child who had been coddled, protected, and financially insulated from the severe consequences of his own profound mediocrity for 31 years, was convicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and severe tax evasion, receiving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary, a brutal, unforgiving environment where his fabricated tech billionaire persona evaporated on the very first day, leaving him completely exposed to the terrifying reality of his own absolute insignificance. Sterling Vance, the arrogant notary who had so eagerly facilitated the forgery of my home loan just to maintain his standing at the country club, lost his law license, his lucrative practice, and his freedom, sentenced to 8 years for his role as the primary legal architect of the conspiracy. His public weeping in the courtroom serving as a pathetic testament to the cowardice that had always defined his character. But the most poetic, devastating justice was reserved entirely for my parents, Richard and Patricia Caldwell, who were not sentenced to prison but instead condemned to a punishment they considered far worse than physical incarceration: absolute, inescapable poverty and profound, crushing social irrelevance. When the IRS finalized their deep-level forensic audit, they executed a total, uncompromising seizure of the Caldwell estate, legally liquidating the sprawling historic mansion, the luxury vehicles, the heavily padded retirement portfolios, and every single piece of expensive jewelry my mother owned to partially satisfy the massive federal liens attached to the toxic shell company they had so arrogantly demanded from me. They were immediately evicted from the exclusive, gated community they had reigned over for decades and forced to relocate to a cramped, poorly ventilated 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial sector of the city, surviving entirely on my father's meager Social Security checks because every other cent they managed to generate was instantaneously garnished by the federal government to service the astronomical debt they had legally assumed. I did not visit them in their squalor. I did not call them to gloat, and I completely ignored the desperate, tear-stained, handwritten letters my mother began mailing to my corporate office, letters filled with a toxic, nauseating mixture of religious guilt-tripping and pathetic demands for financial salvation, which she deliberately forwarded to me through her sister, my Aunt Vivian, who eventually showed up unannounced in my high-security corporate lobby one Tuesday afternoon, attempting to leverage traditional familial obligation to force a reconciliation. I met Aunt Vivian in the sleek, glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor, sitting quietly across the polished mahogany table as she wept into a tissue and told me that my parents were struggling to afford their heating bill, that my mother was slipping into a severe unmedicated depression, and that as the only successful, wealthy child left in the bloodline, it was my fundamental Christian duty to forgive their transgressions, open my checkbook, and step back into my rightful role as the family's caretaker. I listened to her impassioned, emotionally manipulative speech without interrupting, my hands resting calmly on the table, feeling absolutely no guilt, no obligation, and no lingering attachment to the historical trauma they were desperately trying to repackage as unconditional love. "Aunt Vivian," I said softly, my voice carrying the steady, immovable weight of a matriarch who had permanently retired from the exhausting business of saving her abusers. "My parents did not just make a simple parenting mistake. They spent 20 years systematically stealing my inheritance. They maliciously forged my signature to extract the equity from my home, and they actively, aggressively tried to hand me a $42 million federal prison sentence just to protect a degenerate son who ultimately offered to sell them both out to the FBI the second he was arrested." I slid a sealed, heavy cream envelope across the table, containing a single one-way first-class plane ticket back to her home state and a check for $5,000. "You are more than welcome to use these funds to pay their heating bill if your conscience absolutely demands it, but I have officially resigned from the position of the Caldwell family's sacrificial lamb, and if you ever attempt to bring their chaotic, manipulative demands into my sanctuary again, this will be the absolute last time we ever speak." She looked down at the check, then looked up into my cold, entirely unbothered eyes, her face going completely pale as she finally understood that the unbreakable foundation they had abused for 33 years had not just cracked. It had fundamentally relocated, leaving them to build the remainder of their miserable lives on the unstable, rotting swamp of their own unchecked entitlement. With the final pathetic remnants of my toxic family permanently exiled from my reality, I turned my absolute undivided attention toward my own future, executing a personal and financial pivot that felt less like a lifestyle transition and more like a profound spiritual resurrection. The quiet, practical 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, the very house they had forged my name to steal, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a heavy, suffocating museum of my past trauma, a physical monument to the exhausted, subservient daughter I used to be, who believed she had to hide her brilliance just to survive Sunday dinners. I quietly placed the property on the market, utilizing my elite financial connections to sell it for a substantial all-cash profit within 2 weeks to a young, eager corporate couple who had absolutely no idea that the modest living room had once been the staging ground for a multi-million-dollar corporate execution. I did not buy another house in the suburbs. Instead, I utilized a fraction of my heavily protected, legitimately acquired corporate wealth to purchase a sprawling, breathtakingly modern penthouse apartment located on the very top floor of a high-security, ultra-exclusive residential tower overlooking the shimmering, infinite expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist, elegant design, featuring soaring 15-foot ceilings, imported white marble floors that reflected the sunlight like glass, and massive, wraparound floor-to-ceiling windows that completely dissolved the boundary between my private living space and the majestic horizon of the sea. I furnished it exactly to my own precise, uncompromising tastes, deliberately stripping away the heavy, suffocating traditionalism of my parents' aesthetic and replacing it with sleek contemporary lines, original, vibrant, abstract art, and lush indoor greenery that breathed life and pure, unadulterated peace into every single room. I hired a private chef to prepare my meals, ensuring my body was nourished with exactly the care I had always provided for others. A personal trainer to help me rebuild my physical strength and stamina, and a high-end stylist to completely overhaul my wardrobe, finally permanently discarding the frumpy, oversized cardigans, and scuffed loafers I had used as camouflage for so long. I filled my massive walk-in closet with impeccably tailored designer suits, flawless silk blouses, and the kind of expensive, aggressively powerful footwear that commanded absolute immediate respect the moment I stepped into any corporate boardroom in the city. My firm, Apex Resolution Partners, experienced an unprecedented explosion of growth in the absence of my family's constant emotional drain, doubling its revenue within the fiscal year as I aggressively expanded our operations internationally, entirely unburdened by the exhausting, invisible weight of wondering what disaster Preston was creating or what manipulation my mother was currently plotting. On a quiet, pristine Sunday morning, exactly 1 year to the day after the Michelin-starred dinner that had catalyzed the absolute destruction of my toxic family, I woke up in my massive, cloud-like, king-sized bed, surrounded by the soft, luxurious embrace of 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets, completely, entirely alone, and profoundly, beautifully happy. I did not wake up to the frantic, demanding vibration of my cell phone. I did not wake up with the crushing, suffocating anxiety of wondering what catastrophic financial crisis I was expected to solve. And I did not wake up feeling the heavy, invisible chains of my parents' conditional, transactional love wrapped tightly around my throat. I simply opened my eyes, listening to the absolute silence of the penthouse, watching the early morning sunlight spill across the white marble floors, casting long, elegant shadows that danced gently against the pristine walls of my bedroom. I slipped into a heavy emerald green silk robe, tying the sash loosely around my waist, and walked slowly out into the expansive, sunlit kitchen. The only sound, the soft, rhythmic crash of the ocean waves echoing through the slightly open balcony doors. I prepared a single cup of expensive pour-over coffee, taking my time to savor the rich, dark aroma, filling the pristine air, feeling a deep, vibrating sense of gratitude for the beautiful monotony of a morning that belonged entirely to me. I stepped out onto the massive glass-walled terrace, the cool, salty ocean breeze immediately washing over my face, carrying away the last microscopic traces of my past as I leaned against the railing and looked out at the endless, shimmering expanse of the water. For the first time in my entire 34 years of existence, I was not holding the line for anyone. I was not desperately protecting anyone from their own weaponized incompetence, and I was not shrinking my intellect, my wealth, or my power to make room for someone else's fragile, unearned ego. The Caldwell family was currently waking up in a cramped, freezing apartment in the industrial district, surrounded by the rotting decay of their own hubris, drowning in the absolute, inescapable misery they had meticulously engineered for themselves, while I stood at the absolute pinnacle of the breathtaking world I had built with my own 2 hands, entirely untouched, deeply sovereign, and fiercely, ruthlessly protective of the magnificent silence I had finally earned. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, raised my chin to the morning sun, and smiled a genuine, radiant smile that belonged entirely, exclusively to me. They spent my entire life assuming I was nothing more than the quiet, unbreakable foundation meant to carry the crushing weight of their empire, completely failing to realize that when you spend decades